The train does not arrive with urgency. It slows, almost gently, as if the journey is ending somewhere ordinary. But this is not a station like any other. It is Birkenau. And for those inside the crowded wooden wagons, this moment will decide everything. The doors slide open. Light floods in after hours, sometimes days of darkness. Voices shout in a language many do not understand. People stumble out onto the gravel, disoriented, clutching what little they were allowed to bring. Families stay close, holding hands, trying to make sense of where they are. There is no time to understand. Within minutes, lines begin to form. Men to one side, women and children to the other. And then something even more decisive. A glance, a gesture, a hand pointing left or right. No explanation is given. No questions are answered. But in that moment, silent, quick, and absolute fates are sealed. Some are sent forward into the camp, into forced labor, into survival for another day. Others are directed elsewhere. They do not yet know where they are going. But the system does. The selection lines of Birkenau were not chaotic. They were organized, deliberate, and repeated thousands of times. Each arrival followed the same pattern. Each decision made within seconds. And behind it all, a structure designed to determine who would live and who would not. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. Arrival at Birkenau, the end of the journey. The journey to Birkenau often began long before the train itself ever appeared. Starting in towns and cities scattered across occupied Europe where families were told to gather with only what they could carry, believing they were being relocated, resettled, or sent somewhere for work. And from that moment onward, the path forward became controlled by a system that moved people step by step toward a destination they could not fully understand. And by the time they were pushed into the freight wagons that would carry them across great distances, the process had already stripped away certainty, replacing it with confusion, fear, and a growing sense that something was not as it had been described, because the wagons themselves were not built for comfort or even basic travel, but for transporting goods, livestock, or materials, and now they were filled beyond capacity with people standing shoulder to shoulder, unable to sit or lie down, the air quickly becoming heavy and difficult to breathe as the doors closed and darkness settled inside, leaving only small cracks of light filtering through the wooden slats. And as the train began to move, the sound of metal wheels against the tracks became the constant rhythm of the journey, marking the passage of time in a way that felt both endless and uncertain, because no one inside the wagons knew how long they would travel or where exactly they were being taken, and as hours turned into days, the conditions inside grew increasingly difficult, with little to no access to water, almost no food, and only a single bucket sometimes provided for basic needs, forcing people to endure the journey in close proximity under conditions that became more oppressive with each passing hour. And yet, even in this confined and uncertain space, people tried to maintain some sense of normality, speaking quietly to one another, holding on to family members, reassuring children who asked questions that could not be answered, and sharing small amounts off whatever they had brought with them, because the human instinct to support one another did not disappear even in such circumstances. But as the journey continued, exhaustion began to take its toll, bodies weakened, voices grew quieter, and the sense of time itself became distorted, with the outside world reduced to brief glimpses through narrow openings when the train slowed or stopped, offering only momentary views of passing landscapes, fields, towns, and distant structures, none of which provided clear answers about the destination ahead. And then, at some point, the movement of the train began to change, slowing more noticeably than before, the sound-off brakes cutting through the steady rhythm of travel, and those inside the wagons felt the shift immediately, As if something significant was about to happen, conversations stopped, attention turned toward the small openings in the wood, and people tried to see outside, to understand where they had arrived. And what they could see often did not resemble a typical station, but something far larger, with rows of structures, tall poles, and distant silhouettes that hinted at an organized complex rather than a place of simple transit. And when the train finally came to a complete stop, there was a brief moment of stillness, a pause between the long journey and whatever would come next. And then, suddenly, the sound of movement outside the wagons broke that silence, voices calling out, "Boots on gravel," and the sliding open of heavy doors that allowed light to flood into the dark interior, forcing those inside to adjust quickly as they stepped or were guided out onto the ground below. And for many, this was the first clear view of Birkenau, though they did not yet know its name or its purpose, only that it was vast, structured, and filled with activity, and that whatever came next would begin immediately without explanation or delay. As the prisoners stepped down from the wagons onto the ramp at Birkenau, the transition from the enclosed darkness of the train to the open space of the camp was immediate and overwhelming, because the platform was not quiet or calm but filled with movement, voices, and a sense of urgency that contrasted sharply with the stillness of the moments just before the doors had opened, and people found themselves surrounded by a structured environment where everything appeared to operate according to a system that they did not yet understand, with guards present, instructions being shouted, and groups of individuals already moving in different directions, creating an atmosphere where hesitation was difficult and confusion spread quickly. And for those who had just arrived, the first instinct was often to stay close to family members, to hold onto familiar faces in a place where nothing else felt certain. But the pace of events did not allow for long moments of adjustment, because almost immediately, instructions were given that began to separate people into groups, with men directed one way and women and children another. And although this might have seemed at first like a temporary organization, something about the speed and firmness with which it was carried out suggested that it was part of a larger process already in motion. And as people moved into these lines, they carried with them the belongings they had brought on the journey, suitcases, bags, and small personal items that represented fragments of their previous lives, though many would soon be required to leave these behind as the system continued to unfold. And all around them, the environment of Birkenau revealed itself more clearly, with long rows of barracks stretching into the distance, fences marking the boundaries of the camp, and watchtowers rising above the perimeter, creating a space that felt both vast and enclosed at the same time. And for those standing on the ramp, trying to understand what was happening, there was little opportunity to ask questions or receive answers, because the process moved forward with a precision that did not allow for explanation, only compliance. And among the figures present on the ramp were individuals who appeared to be observing the arriving groups closely, watching as people stepped forward in lines, their decisions not yet visible in full but already beginning to take shape within the system that governed the camp. And for the prisoners, the experience of arrival was not a single moment but a rapid sequence of actions that carried them from the train to the formation of lines, from confusion to movement, from uncertainty to the beginning of something far more structured. And although they could not yet see the full meaning of what was happening, the atmosphere itself suggested that the journey they had just completed was not the end of the process but only the beginning of a new and far more consequential stage, one that would unfold quickly and decisively. And, as the lines continued to form and the instructions continued to be given, the ramp at Birkenau became the setting for a process that would determine the immediate future of everyone who had just arrived, a place where the transition from transport to selection would take place in a matter of moments, shaping outcomes that could not yet be understood but would soon become clear as the system moved forward without pause, carrying each individual into the next step of a structured design thought process. Arrivals with speed and finality. Chapter 1, Segment 2. The first moments on the ramp, confusion and control. The first moments after arrival at the Birkenau ramp unfolded with a speed and precision that left little room for understanding. as the people who had just stepped down from the train found themselves immediately drawn into a system that seemed already in motion long before they had arrived. And although the journey had ended, the sense of disorientation did not disappear but instead deepened as the environment around them demanded attention, movement, and response all at once, because voices were calling out instructions, guards were directing groups into lines, and the open space of the ramp filled quickly with the presence of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of individuals trying to make sense of what was happening. And in these first minutes, there was no clear explanation offered, only a sequence of actions that needed to be followed, and for many, the instinct to stay close to family members became the most immediate priority. As parents held on to children, siblings remained side by side, and older relatives leaned on those who could support them, creating small clusters of familiarity within a much larger and unfamiliar environment. But even these connections were quickly challenged by the structure of the process, as instructions separated men from women and children, dividing families into different lines with a firmness that left little opportunity for hesitation or protest. And although some individuals tried to ask questions or seek clarification, the pace of movement and the tone of the commands made it clear that the system did not operate through dialogue but through direction. And as the lines began to take shape, the ramp itself revealed more of its purpose, not as a place of arrival in the traditional sense, but as a point of transition where each person would be processed according to criteria that were not yet visible to those standing there. And around them, the physical environment of Birkenau reinforced this sense of structure, with long stretches of gravel underfoot, tracks extending behind the train, and rows of buildings stretching into the distance, all organized in a way that suggested planning and control rather than randomness. And within this setting, the individuals on the ramp became part of a larger flow of movement, guided from one position to another without fully understanding the reasons behind each step. And yet, even in this controlled process, human reactions remained present, as some people looked around in silence, trying to observe and interpret what they saw, while others spoke quietly to those beside them, attempting to reassure or make sense of the situation. And children, often the most visibly confused, asked questions that adults struggled to answer, because the reality of the situation had not yet been revealed to them, only hinted at through the urgency and structure of the moment. And as time passed, though it felt compressed and uncertain, the initial chaos of arrival began to settle into a more defined arrangement, with lines becoming clearer, groups more organized, and the next stage of the process approaching, though still not fully understood by those who were now standing in place, waiting for what would come next, their journey having brought them to his point where movement had slowed but uncertainty remained, suspended in the space between arrival and decision. As the lines on the ramp became more structured, the atmosphere shifted from the initial confusion of arrival to a more controlled and directed phase, where each individual began to sense that the next steps would not be random but part of a deliberate system, even if its purpose was not yet fully visible. And at the center of this process were figures who observed the arriving prisoners with focused attention, individuals whose role was to make decisions quickly, based on criteria that were not explained to those being evaluated. And as the lines moved forward, one by one, each person approached this point of decision, often without understanding that such a moment had even arrived, because the process did not announce itself with clarity but unfolded through gestures, brief instructions, and movements that carried individuals in one direction or another. And for those standing in line, the experience was both immediate and surreal, as they watched others ahead of them step forward and then move away, guided by a simple indication that seemed to determine their path without explanation. And within these moments, the separation that had begun earlier, between men and women, between adults and children, took on a deeper significance, as families who had already been divided now found themselves moving further apart, sometimes unable to maintain even visual contact with one another as the lines progressed. And yet the instinct to remain connected persisted, as people turned their heads to look for familiar faces, called out names softly, or tried to signal reassurance with small gestures, even as the system continued to move them forward. And around them, the environment remained active, with guards maintaining order, other groups arriving or being processed, and the structures of the camp forming a constant backdrop to the unfolding events. And in this setting, time seemed to behave differently, as minutes felt both rapid and extended, each step forward bringing the individual closer to a moment that would determine their immediate future, though they could not yet fully grasp its significance. And for some, the experience created a sense of anticipation, not of understanding but of awareness that something important was happening, while for others, the focus remained on the present moment, on staying upright, on following instructions, on remaining close to those they could still see. And as each person reached the point where a decision was made, the process continued without pause, one after another, the lines moving steadily, the system operating with a consistency that suggested it had been repeated many times before. And as the final individuals from the transport approached this stage, the ramp itself began to clear slightly, the initial density of arrival giving way to a more organized distribution of people across different directions. And in the distance, those who had already passed through this process were no longer visible, having been guided further into the camp or elsewhere, leaving those still in line with only the immediate moment to focus on. And as the segment of the transport was fully processed, the ramp returned to a state of readiness, prepared for the next arrival, while those who had just passed through it were carried forward into different paths, their futures already shaped by decisions made in moments they could scarcely comprehend at the time, marking the transition from arrival to outcome in a system designed to move quickly, efficiently, and without explanation. Chapter 1, Segment 3. The division begins, families separated. As the process on the Birkenau ramp continued to unfold, one of the most immediate and visible changes experienced by those arriving was the separation of families, a moment that did not always arrive with clear explanation but instead emerged as part of the structured instructions that guided people into different lines. And in those first minutes after stepping down from the train, many had already been directed into groups based on broad categories. Men to one side, women and children to another. But as the lines moved forward, these divisions became more defined, more permanent, and more difficult to reverse, because the system did not allow for negotiation or consideration once a direction had been given. And for families who had endured the long journey together, sharing space in the crowded wagons, supporting one another through uncertainty, the sudden requirement to separate created a moment of confusion and emotional strain that stood in sharp contrast to the instinct to remain together, and yet the pace of the process allowed little time for reaction, as guards and overseers directed movement with urgency, signaling where each person should stand, where they should go, and when they should move, creating a flow that carried individuals forward whether they fully understood it or not. And within this movement, small moments of hesitation appeared, as parents looked back toward children, as siblings tried to remain within sight of one another, as older family members reached out to maintain contact for as long as possible. But these gestures were often brief, interrupted by the continued progression of the lines, and as the distance between separated groups increased, communication became more difficult, reduced to quick glances, raised hands, or final words, spoken across a space that was widening with each step. And for many, this was the first realization that the journey had not only brought them to a new location, but had also begun to dismantle the structure of their personal lives, dividing them into categories that did not reflect their relationships but rather the needs of the system that now controlled their movements. And yet, even in this moment, the full meaning of the separation was not always understood, as some believed it to be temporary, assuming that they would be reunited after registration or assignment, because the idea that such divisions might be permanent was difficult to grasp in the absence of clear information. And so they continued to move forward, guided by instructions, holding on to the belief that the separation was part of a process that would eventually bring them back together, even as the physical reality suggested otherwise. And around them, the ramp continued to operate with the same steady rhythm. New arrivals stepping down from trains, lines forming and reforming, decisions being made, and groups moving away in different directions, all within a system that functioned with a consistency that left little room for individual circumstances, and as each family was divided, the collective experience of separation became one of the defining features of arrival at Birkenau, shaping the emotional landscape of the moment as much as the physical environment itself, marking a transition not only from journey to camp, but from unity to division, from shared experience to individual paths that would soon diverge in ways that could not yet be fully understood. As the separation of families continued across the ramp, the process revealed itself not as a series of isolated moments but as a repeated pattern applied to each arriving group, reinforcing the sense that what was happening was not accidental but intentional, part of a broader system designed to categorize and direct individuals according to specific criteria. And for those who had already been divided from their loved ones, the experience did not end with the initial separation but extended into the next stages of movement, as each line progressed toward further decisions that would determine where each person would go next. And within these lines, the absence of familiar faces became increasingly noticeable, as individuals found themselves surrounded by strangers, all sharing the same uncertainty but each carrying their own personal story of separation. And in his environment, the emotional response varied, with some maintaining a quiet composure, focusing on following instructions and observing their surroundings, while others expressed visible distress, calling out names or looking back in the direction where they had last seen their family members, hoping for a glimpse or a sign that connection had not been entirely lost. And yet the structure of the process did not pause to accommodate these reactions, continuing forward with a steady pace that carried each person further away from the point of separation. And as Thelans moved, the physical space of the ramp began to open up, with fewer people remaining near the train and more being directed toward different areas of the camp, creating a sense of dispersal that made it increasingly difficult to track where others had gone. And in this shifting landscape, the initial belief that families might be reunited began to fade for some, replaced by a growing awareness that the system operated independently of personal relationships, prioritizing its own structure over the connections that had defined the lives of those within it. And yet, even in this realization, hope did not disappear entirely, as many continued to hold on to the possibility that the separation was temporary, that somewhere within the camp there would be an opportunity to find one another again, because the alternative, that this moment marked a final division, was too difficult to accept without certainty. And so they continued forward, step by step, guided by instructions, carried along by the movement of the line, entering deeper into the camp environment, where new stages of processing awaited them, and behind them, the ramp remained active, ready for the next arrival, while the traces of each previous group, footprints in the gravel, scattered belongings, the echoes of voices, faded quickly as the system reset itself for repetition. And in this way, the separation of families at Birkenau became not only a personal experience for those who lived through it but also a structural element of the camp's operation, repeated with each transport, shaping the experience of arrival for countless individuals, and marking one of the earliest and most profound moments of transformation within the process that awaited them. As the journey from train to camp continued, now defined by division, uncertainty, and the beginning of paths that would lead in very different directions. Chapter 2, Segment 1. The Moment of Selection, a Decision in Seconds. As the final groups from the transport were guided into position, the process that had begun with confusion and separation now moved into a phase that would quietly determine the immediate future of every individual standing on the Birkenau ramp, a moment that unfolded without formal announcement yet carried immense consequence. Because at the center of this system stood a point where decisions were made quickly, often within seconds, and those decisions would shape the direction each person would take next. And for those in line, the approach toward this moment was gradual, marked by small steps forward, the sound of gravel underfoot, the shifting of body as the line advanced, and the growing awareness that something important lay ahead, even if its exact nature remained unclear. And as they moved closer, individuals could observe the pattern of movement before them, seeing how those at the front of the line would step forward, pause briefly, and then be directed either to one side or another, guided by a simple gesture or instruction that seemed to carry weight far beyond its simplicity. And within this observation, a sense of anticipation began to build, as people tried to interpret what they were witnessing, forming quiet assumptions or exchanging brief words with those nearby, attempting to understand the meaning behind the process. Yet the speed at which it unfolded left little time for certainty, and so they continued forward, drawn by the movement of the line itself. Their attention fixed on the moment when it would be their turn, and as each individual reached this point, the interaction was brief, often consisting of a glance, a question, or a gesture, after which they were directed to move in a particular direction, joining others who had been assigned the same path. And for many, the brevity of this exchange was disorienting, as it contrasted sharply with the significance of what was being decided, creating a sense that something important had just occurred, though its full implications were not yet understood. And within these moments, physical appearance, perceivage, and visible conditions seemed to play a role in the decision, though the criteria were not explained, leaving those in line to rely on observation and intuition as they approached their own turn. And as the process continued, the line maintained its steady pace, each person stepping forward in sequence, the system operating with a consistency that suggested it had been repeated many times before. And around them, the environment of the ramp remained active yet focused, with guards maintaining order, other groups being processed, and the structures of the camp standing in the distance, silent yet imposing, reinforcing the sense that this moment was not isolated but part of a larger mechanism. And for those still waiting, the seconds stretched, filled with anticipation and uncertainty, as they prepared to step forward into a moment that would pass quickly yet carry consequences that extended far beyond the brief interaction itself, marking the transition from arrival to assignment within the structured system of Birkenau. As each individual passed through the point of selection, the consequences of the decision began to take shape in the physical movement that followed, as those directed to one side found themselves joining a group that was guided toward one area of the camp, while others, sent in a different direction, moved toward another path, creating a visible division that extended beyond the earlier separation of families and into a more defined categorization of individuals. And for those who had just been directed, the immediate focus remained on following instructions, on keeping pace with the group, and on observing the surroundings in an attempt to understand where they were being taken. Yet the meaning of the decision that had just been made often remained unclear, because the process did not include explanation, only action, and so individuals continued forward, carrying with them a mixture of uncertainty and tentative assumptions about what lay ahead. And within these groups, small conversations sometimes emerged, as people compared what they had seen or experienced, trying to piece together an understanding of the system. Yet the lack of consistent information meant that these interpretations varied, shaped by individual perspective rather than confirmed knowledge. And as the groups moved further from the ramp, the distance between them increased, making it more difficult to maintain any connection with those who had been directed elsewhere. And for some, this created a growing sense of realization that the decision made at the point of selection was not temporary but part of a structured process that would continue to guide their path within the camp. And yet even in this realization, many held on to the possibility that the system might allow for change or reunification at a later stage, because the absence of clear information left space for hope as well as uncertainty, and so they continued forward, step by step, guided by the movement of the group and the instructions of those overseeing the process, entering deeper into the environment of Birkenau where new stages of processing awaited. And behind them, the ramp continued to function, receiving new arrivals, repeating the same sequence of events, the same lines forming, the same decisions being made, each transport passing through the same moment of selection that had just shaped their own path. And in this way, the process became both individual and collective, experienced personally by each person yet repeated systematically across countless arrivals, reinforcing the structure of the camp as a place where decisions were made quickly, efficiently, and without explanation, shaping the course of each individual's experience from the very moment of arrival. And as those who had passed through this stage moved further into the camp, the significance of that brief interaction began to settle in, not as a fully understood reality, but as a turning point that marked the beginning of a new phase, one defined by the direction they had been given, the group they now belonged to, and the path that lay ahead within the structured and controlled environment of Birkenau. Chapter 2, Segment 2. The two paths, those sent forward, those sent away. After the moment of selection, the division that had begun on the ramp now extended into two distinct paths, each shaped by the brief decision made in seconds yet carrying consequences that unfolded gradually. And for those who had been directed to continue forward, the immediate experience was one of movement into the interior of the camp, guided in groups that walked together under the watch of guards, leaving behind the open space of the ramp and entering a more structured environment where the layout of Birkenau became increasingly visible, with Rausoff barracks stretching into the distance, fences marking boundaries, and pathways connecting different sections, all arranged with a sense of order that contrasted with the uncertainty of the moment. And as these groups moved, individuals began to take in their surroundings more closely, noticing details that had not been apparent upon arrival, such as the condition of the ground beneath their feet, the appearance of the buildings they were approaching, and the presence of other prisoners who were already within the camp, their movements and expressions offering subtle clues about the reality of life inside. And within this progression, the earlier separation from family members remained present in their thoughts, as many continued to look around for familiar faces, hoping to recognize someone among the groups moving in parallel or standing nearby. Yet the increasing distance from the ramp made such recognition more difficult, and the focus gradually shifted toward the immediate task of following instructions, staying with the group and adapting to the new environment. And as they advanced further, the process began to introduce additional steps, such as being directed toward specific areas for registration or initial processing, though these stages were not always clearly explained, unfolding instead as a sequence of actions that individuals were expected to follow without question. And within this environment, the sense of individuality began to diminish, as the system treated each person as part of a larger group, moving them collectively from one point to another, reinforcing the structured nature of the camp's operation. And yet, even within this system, personal reactions continued to surface, as some individuals observed quietly, trying to understand the patterns around them, while others spoke in low voices, sharing observations or asking questions that often remained unanswered. And as time passed, the realization that they had been directed along one of the possible paths began to take shape, not as a fully understood outcome, but as an emerging awareness that the decision made on the ramp had placed them within a specific category, one that would influence their experience within the camp. And although the full meaning of this path was not yet clear, the continuation of movement, the introduction of new stages, and the visible structure of the camp all suggested that they were being integrated into a system that would define their daily existence, marking the beginning of a new phase that extended beyond arrival and into the ongoing reality of Birkenau. At the same time, for those who had been directed along the other path, the experience unfolded differently, though it remained equally structured and controlled, as these individuals were guided away from the main flow of those entering the camp's interior, moving in groups that followed a separate direction, often with fewer visible landmarks to indicate where they were being taken. And within these groups, the atmosphere carried a different quality, shaped by the absence of clear information and the uncertainty of what lay ahead, as individuals continued to follow instructions without a full understanding of their destination, relying on the movement of those around them and the guidance of guards to navigate the path. And for many, the separation from family members weighed heavily in these moments, as the inability to maintain contact or even visual connection created a sense of isolation that contrasted sharply with the shared experience of the journey they had just completed. And yet, even within this uncertainty, the process maintained its steady pace, with groups moving forward in an organized manner, directed from one point to another with a consistency that suggested the system operated with a defined purpose, even if that purpose was not explained to those within it. And as they moved further away from the ramp, the physical environment began to change, with the open space giving way to more enclosed or specific areas, though the details of these spaces were not always immediately clear, contributing to the sense of disorientation that accompanied the transition. And within these moments, individuals often relied on observation and intuition, trying to interpret the significance of their surroundings, the behavior of those guiding them, and the overall direction of movement. Yet the lack of explicit information meant that these interpretations remained uncertain, shaped by perception rather than confirmed understanding. And as the group continued forward, the separation between the two paths became more pronounced, with those on each path no longer able to see or connect with the other, reinforcing the finality of the division that had begun on the ramp. And for those within this path, the experience became one of progression into an unknown stage of the process, guided by a system that moved forward without pause, carrying them toward a destination that remained undefined in their minds, yet clearly structured within the operation of the camp. And in this way, the two paths created by the moment of selection extended beyond the immediate decision, shaping the physical movement, the environment, and the experience of each individual as they moved deeper into Birkenau, marking a divergence that would continue to influence their journey within the camp, even as the full implications of that divergence remained hidden from view. Chapter 2, Segment 3. The silence after selection realization begins. After the division into separate paths, a noticeable shift began to settle over those who had passed through the moment of selection, a kind of quiet that was different from the earlier noise and urgency of the ramp, because while movement still continued, it did so with less confusion and more direction. And within this quieter progression, individuals found themselves with more space to think, to observe, and to reflect on what had just happened, even if they could not yet fully understand it. And as they moved deeper into the camp or along the path assigned to them, the absence of familiar voices became more apparent, as the separation from family members and companions created a silence that was not empty but filled with unspoken thoughts, questions, and realizations. And in this silence, small details began to stand out more clearly, such as the expressions of other prisoners already present in the camp, the way they moved, the way they looked at the new arrivals, often with a quiet awareness that suggested they understood something the newcomers did not yet know. And these observations, though subtle, began to shape the perception of those who had just arrived, creating a growing sense that the system they had entered was more complex and more serious than it had first appeared on the ramp. And as they continued forward, the structured environment of Birkenau revealed itself in greater detail, with its long rows of barracks, its defined pathways, and its guarded boundaries, all contributing to a sense of order that contrasted with the uncertainty of their situation. And within this environment, the earlier belief that the separation might be temporary began to shift for some, replaced by a more cautious awareness that the system operated according to its own logic, one that did not necessarily align with personal expectations or assumptions. And yet, even as this realization began to form, it did so gradually, not as a sudden understanding but as a series of small observations that accumulated over time, each one adding to a picture that was still incomplete. And within this process, individuals often turned inward, focusing on their own thoughts, recalling the moments on the ramp, the brief interaction at the point of selection, the last sight of family members, trying to piece together meaning from events that had unfolded so quickly. And as they walked, the rhythm of their steps, the presence of others around them, and the steady guidance of the system created a sense of continuity, even as the internal experience remained uncertain. And in this way, the silence that followed selection became not just an absence of noise but a space in which realization could begin, slowly and unevenly, as each individual processed the transition from arrival to assignment, from confusion to a growing awareness of the structure that now defined their path. As this period of quiet movement continued, the realization that something significant had taken place on the ramp began to deepen, not through direct explanation but through the accumulation of experience. As individuals observed the patterns around them, the behavior of others, and the unfolding of the process they were now part of. And within this gradual understanding, the moment of selection took on a new weight, as it became clear that the brief interaction they had experienced was not a simple step in a routine procedure but a defining point that had set their course within the camp. And for some, this realization brought a sense of unease, as the absence of clear information left room for uncertainty about what lay ahead, while for others, it created focus on the present moment, on adapting to the immediate environment and following the instructions given, because the need to respond to the current situation often outweighed the ability to fully comprehend it. And as they moved further into their assigned areas, the structure of the camp became more evident, with specific zones, routines, and roles beginning to take shape, offering a clearer sense of how the system functioned on a day-to-day basis, even if its broader purpose remained partially hidden. And within this environment, interactions with other prisoners sometimes provided additional context, as those who had been in the camp longer might offer brief guidance, gestures, or words that hinted at the realities of life inside, though these interactions were often limited and shaped by the constraints of the system itself. And as the hours passed, the initial shock of arrival began to transition into a more sustained awareness of the situation. As individuals adjusted to the rhythms of the camp, the expectations placed upon them, and the physical and social environment that surrounded them, and yet the memory of the ramp remained present, particularly the moment of selection, which now stood out as a turning point, a moment that had divided not only groups of people but also the paths their lives would take within this system. And as this understanding continued to develop, it did so alongside the ongoing experience of the camp, shaping how individuals perceived their surroundings, their position within the system, and the possibilities that lay ahead. And in this way, the silence after selection became a space of transition, where the immediate confusion of arrival gave way to a deeper, more complex awareness, one that would continue to evolve as they moved further into the reality of Birkenau, carrying with them the memory of that brief, decisive moment that had shaped everything that followed. Chapter 3, Segment 1. Entering the camp, the first steps inside Birkenau. As those who had been directed forward continued their movement away from the ramp, the transition into the interior of Birkenau became more defined, marking a shift from the moment of arrival into the beginning of life within the camp itself. And this transition was not marked by a single clear boundary but rather unfolded gradually, as the environment changed around them, the open space of the ramp giving way to a more structured landscape of pathways, fences, and rouse-off barracks that stretched outward in a pattern that suggested both order and control. And as they walked, the physical features of the camp began to assert themselves more strongly, with the ground beneath their feet often uneven, the air carrying unfamiliar scents, and the buildings ahead appearing uniform in design yet varied in condition, each detail contributing to a growing awareness that they had entered a place designed with a specific purpose, even if that purpose was not yet fully understood. And within this movement, the groups that had formed after selection remained intact, guided together toward designated areas where the next stages of processing would take place. And as they approached these areas, the presence of other prisoners became more noticeable, individuals who had already been in the camp and who now moved through their routines with a familiarity that contrasted with the uncertainty of the new arrivals. And these encounters, though often brief, provided subtle signals about the reality of life inside Birkenau, as the expressions, posture, and behavior of those already present suggested an understanding shaped by experience. And for the newcomers, observing these individuals became one of the few ways to gather information about what lay ahead, even if that information was indirect and incomplete. And as they continued forward, the structure of the camp revealed itself further, with fences marking boundaries that extended into the distance, watchtowers positioned at intervals, and pathways connecting different sections in a way that guided movement while also restricting it, creating an environment where direction was controlled and freedom of movement was limited. And within this setting, the earlier sense of disorientation began to give way to a more focused awareness of surroundings, as individuals paid closer attention to details, trying to orient themselves within the space, to understand where they were and where they might be going next. And yet, even as this awareness developed, it remained incomplete, shaped by observation rather than explanation. and as they reached the areas designated for initial processing, the pace-off movement slowed slightly, allowing for a more concentrated experience of the environment. As groups were directed to stop, to wait, or to move in smaller increments, and within these pauses, the reality of their situation began to settle more firmly, as the transition from the journey to the camp became undeniable, and the structures around them, the people within them, and the system guiding their movements all combined to create a sense of entry into a new phase, one that would be defined not by travel or arrival, but by the routines and conditions of life inside Birkenau, marking the beginning of an experience that would unfold over time, shaped by the environment, the system, and the individual responses to both. As the groups moved deeper into the camp and approached the areas where initial procedures would begin, the experience of entering Birkenau took on a more immediate and tangible form, as individuals were directed into spaces that served specific functions within the camp's operation. And within these spaces, the process of integration into the system began to unfold, often through a series of steps that were carried out with efficiency and repetition, reflecting the structured nature of the environment. And for those undergoing this process, the experience was both physical and psychological, as they were required to respond to instructions, to move in accordance with the system, and to adapt quickly to a set of expectations that were not always explained but were clearly enforced. And as these steps progressed, the sense of individuality continued to shift, as personal identity became less central within the framework of the camp, replaced by roles, categories, and positions within the system. And this shift was not always immediately understood, but became more apparent through the repetition of actions and the uniformity of the process. And within this environment, interactions with others took on a different quality, as communication was often limited, shaped by the constraints of the system and the shared uncertainty of those experiencing it. Yet even within these limitations, small moments of connection could still occur, as individuals exchanged brief words, gestures, or glances that conveyed understanding, reassurance, or shared experience, and these moments, though subtle, contributed to the human dimension of the experience, providing a counterpoint to the structured and impersonal nature of the system. And as time passed, the initial shock of entering the camp began to evolve into a more sustained awareness of the environment, as individuals became more attuned to the rhythms of movement, the expectations placed upon them, and the physical layout of the space. And within this growing awareness, the memory of the ramp and the moment of selection remained present, now seen as the beginning of a process that continued to unfold with each step taken inside the camp. And as the procedures of entry progressed, the groups were gradually distributed into different areas, each with its own function and role within the broader system, further reinforcing the structure of the camp and the place of each individual within it. And in this way, the act of entering Birkenau became not just a physical movement from one place to another, but a transition into a defined and controlled environment, where the patterns of daily life would be shaped by the system that governed it, and where the initial moments of arrival would give way to an ongoing experience that extended far beyond the first steps taken inside, marking the beginning of a new reality that would continue to unfold in the days that followed. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Registration and Processing: Losing Identity. As the newly arrived prisoners were guided further into Birkenau, the next stage of their experience began to unfold in designated processing areas where the system shifted from movement to transformation, and within these spaces, the structured nature of the camp became even more apparent, as individuals were directed through a sequence of steps that were designated to register, categorize, and integrate them into the camp's internal order. And for those entering this phase, the experience was marked by a gradual but noticeable shift in how they were perceived and treated, as the personal identities they had carried with them, names, professions, histories, and relationships, began to recede in importance, replaced by the requirements of the system that now defined their presence. And as they moved through these procedures, they were often instructed to line up, to wait, and to proceed in a specific order, creating a rhythm of movement that emphasized uniformity and control. And within this rhythm, the individuality of each person became less visible, as the process treated them as part of a collective group rather than as distinct individuals. and as they progressed, the physical aspects of the process became more pronounced, as they were required to undergo steps that altered their outward appearance and marked their transition into the camp environment. And while these steps varied in detail, their overall effect was consistent, creating a sense of uniformity that aligned with the structured nature of Birkenau. And as these changes took place, the emotional impact began to surface, as individuals became aware that the process was not only organizing them within the camp but also reshaping how they were recognized within it. And for many, this realization came gradually, as they observed others undergoing the same procedures, saw the results of these changes reflected around them, and began to understand that the system was designed to standardize and control, rather than to preserve personal identity. And within this environment, communication was often limited, with instructions delivered in a manner that prioritized efficiency over explanation, leaving individuals to interpret the meaning of the process through observation and experience. And as they moved from one step to the next, the continuity of the procedure reinforced the sense that this was not a temporary phase but a foundational part of life within the camp, a process that established the framework through which all subsequent experiences would be shaped. And as the groups continued to advance, the cumulative effect of these steps became more evident, as the transformation from arrival to integration into the system took form, marking a transition that was both visible and internal, as the external changes were accompanied by a growing awareness of the new reality they had entered. And in this way, the registration and processing stage became a defining moment in the early experience of Birkenau, where the structures of the camp asserted themselves most clearly, and where the shift from personal identity to assigned role began to take hold, shaping how individuals would be seen, treated, and understood within the system that now governed their lives. As the processing continued, the transformation initiated in the earlier steps became more firmly established, as individuals were assigned identifiers that replaced their names within the system, creating a new form of recognition that was functional rather than personal. And this assignment marked a significant point in the transition, as it formalized the shift from individuality to categorization, embedding each person within the administrative structure of the camp. And as these identifiers were recorded and used, the interaction between the individual and the system changed, as communication, movement, and organization were now guided by these assigned markers, reinforcing the structured nature of the environment. And within this framework, the sense of personal identity did not disappear entirely but was often internalized, as individuals continued to carry their memories, relationships, and sense of self within, even as the external system recognized them in a different way. And this dual experience of internal identity and external categorization became a defining feature of life within Birkenau, shaping how individuals navigated their environment and understood their place within it. And as the processing reached its later stages, the groups that had been moving together began to disperse into different sections of the camp, each assigned to specific areas that would determine their immediate living conditions and roles. And this distribution further reinforced the structure of the system, as it organized individuals into defined spaces and functions, creating a network of interconnected areas that together formed the operational framework of the camp. And as individuals were guided to these areas, the initial phase of registration came to a close, replaced by the beginning of daily routines that would continue to shape their experience. And within these new spaces, the presence of others who had already undergone the same process provided a sense of continuity, as the patterns of behavior, movement, and interaction established by those already in the camp offered a model for the newcomers to observe and adapt to. And as time passed, the memory of the processing stage remained significant, as it marked the point at which the transition from arrival to integration was completed, and where the structures of the camp had been most clearly imposed upon the individual. And in reflecting on this phase, it became evident that the process was not only administrative but also transformative, reshaping how individuals were positioned within the system and how they would experience the environment moving forward. And as the newly processed prisoners settled into their assigned areas, the initial uncertainty of arrival began to give way to a more defined, though still challenging, understanding of life within Birkenau, as the routines, expectations, and structures of the camp became more familiar, and the process of adaptation began to take shape, marking the continuation of their journey within a system that had now fully integrated them into its framework. Chapter 3, Segment 3. First night in Birkenau, the beginning of routine. As the final stages of registration and processing came to an end, the newly arrived prisoners were guided toward the barracks that would become their first place of rest within Birkenau, marking the transition from the structured procedures of arrival into the beginning of daily life inside the camp. And for many, this movement toward the barracks carried a sense of both exhaustion and uncertainty, as the long journey, the confusion of the ramp, and the intensity of processing had left them physically and mentally drained. Yet the environment they were entering did not offer immediate clarity or comfort, but rather introduced a new set of conditions that would shape their experience moving forward. And as they approached the barracks, the physical structure of these buildings became more apparent. Long wooden constructions arranged in rows, each similar in appearance yet filled with individuals whose experiences and paths had brought them to this shared space. And upon entering, the interior revealed itself as a place designed to accommodate many people within a limited area, with tiered bunks or sleeping platforms arranged in a way that maximized space while minimizing personal separation. And for those entering for the first time, the adjustment to this environment was immediate, as they were directed to find a place among others, often without the ability to choose where or with whom they would stay. And within this process, the sense of individuality continued to diminish, as personal space became limited and the presence of others became a constant aspect of daily life. And as the group settled into the barack, the atmosphere carried a mixture of quiet conversation, movement, and observation. As individuals tried to understand their surroundings, to locate a place to rest, and to process the events of the day, and within these moments, interactions with other prisoners became more frequent, as those who had been in the camp longer sometimes offered brief guidance or instructions, helping the newcomers navigate the immediate challenges of the environment. Though these interactions were often shaped by the constraints and realities of life within the camp, and as evening approached, the transition from the activity of the day to the stillness off night began to take place. Though this stillness was not complete, as the presence of many individuals within a confined space meant that movement, sound, and awareness remained, creating an environment where rest was possible but not always easy. And for those experiencing their first night, the contrast between their previous lives and the current situation became more pronounced, as the unfamiliar setting, the absence of familiar faces, and the conditions of the barack combined to create a sense of disorientation that extended beyond the physical environment and into the emotional and psychological experience. And as they lay down or found a place to sit, the events of the day often returned to their thoughts. The arrival, the separation, the selection, and the processing forming a sequence that was difficult to fully comprehend, yet impossible to ignore. And within this reflection, the realization that they had entered a new and uncertain phase of life began to settle more deeply, marking the beginning of an experience that would continue to unfold in the days and nights that followed. As the night progressed, the initial attempts to rest were shaped by the realities of the barack environment, where the presence of many individuals in close proximity created a shared experience that was both collective and deeply personal. As each person navigated their own thoughts, memories, and reactions within a space that offered little privacy. And within this setting, the sounds of the barack, quiet voices, shifting movements, the subtle rhythms of those trying to sleep, formed a backdrop that accompanied the transition from wakefulness to rest, though for many, sleep did not come easily, as the unfamiliar conditions, combined with the emotional weight of the day, made it difficult to fully relax, and instead, periods of rest were often interspersed with moments of wakefulness, where individuals found themselves reflecting on what had happened, considering what might come next, and trying to make sense of their new reality. And as these moments unfolded, the presence of others in the barack provided a form of shared experience, as the awareness that others were going through similar thoughts and challenges created a subtle sense of connection, even if direct communication was limited. And within this shared space, Small gestures and interactions continued to occur as individuals adjusted their positions, made room for others, or exchanged brief words, contributing to a sense of community that existed within the constraints of the environment. And as time passed, the night moved toward its later hours, and the barack settled into a quieter state, though the underlying awareness of the environment remained, shaped by the structures of the camp and the expectations that would define the next day. And for those experiencing their first night, this period marked an important transition, as the initial shock of arrival began to give way to a more sustained awareness of life within Birkenau, and as the first signs of morning approached, whether through changes in light or the movement of others preparing for the day ahead, the realization that this environment would continue to shape their daily experience became more concrete, and the routines of the camp, though not yet fully understood, began to emerge as the framework within which they would live. And in this way, the first night in Birkenau served Auschwitz an ending and a beginning, closing the chapter of arrival and opening the path toward the routines and realities that would define their time within the camp, marking the moment when the experience shifted from a series of events into an ongoing condition, one that would continue to unfold with each passing day. Chapter 4, Segment 1. The Morning Routine, the Camp Awakens. The first morning inside Birkenau did not begin gently, nor did it follow the rhythms of ordinary life that many of the prisoners had once known, but instead unfolded with a sudden and structured urgency that quickly replaced whatever rest the night had offered, as the barracks, which had settled into a fragile quiet during the late hours, were brought back to movement by signals that indicated the start of a new day. And for those experiencing this routine for the first time, the transition from night to morning was immediate and disorienting, as the need to respond quickly to instructions left little time for adjustment, and within moments, individuals were expected to organize themselves, and to prepare for the sequence of actions that would define the early part of the day. And as they did so, the physical environment of the barack became more active, with people moving from their sleeping places, adjusting their clothing, and preparing to step outside, creating a collective motion that filled the space with sound and activity. And for many, the unfamiliarity of the process made it difficult to know exactly what was expected, leading them to rely on observation, watching those around them, particularly those who had already been in the camp longer, and following their actions as a way to navigate the situation. And as they moved outside, the broader environment of Birkenau revealed itself in the morning light, with the rows of barracks, the open spaces between them, and the surrounding fences all becoming more visible, creating a clearer sense of the scale and structure of the camp. And within this setting, the groups that had formed the previous day began to assemble again, gathering in designated areas where the next stage of the morning routine would take place. And as they stood together, often in lines, the atmosphere carried a mix of alertness and fatigue, as the events of the previous day and night had not yet fully settled. Yet the demands of the present moment required immediate attention, and within these formations, the system of the camp became more evident, as the organization of people into groups, the arrangement of lines, and the presence of guards overseeing the process all contributed to a sense of order that was both structured and enforced. And as the routine continued, individuals began to understand that this sequence of actions was not unique to this morning but part of a daily pattern that would repeat, shaping the rhythm of life within Birkenau. And as they participated in this routine for the first time, the experience served as an introduction to the expectations and constraints that would define their days, marking the beginning of a cycle that extended beyond the initial shock of arrival and into the ongoing reality of the camp, where each morning would begin with similar movements, similar formations, and similar demands, reinforcing the structure of the environment and the place of each individual within it. As the morning routine progressed, the initial assembly gave way to further steps that reinforced the structured nature of life within the camp, as individuals were required to remain in their assigned groups, to follow instructions precisely, and to maintain their position within the formation, creating a sense of discipline that was both visible and expected. And for those who had just arrived, this phase of the routine provided a clearer understanding of how the system operated on a daily basis, as the repetition of actions, the organization of people, and the oversight of the process all combined to create a framework that guided behavior and movement. And within this framework, time took on a different quality, as the duration of each stage of the routine was determined not by personal perception but by the structure of the system itself, leading to periods of waiting, standing, or moving that were defined by external factors rather than individual choice. And as these moments unfolded, the physical experience of the environment became more pronounced, as individuals stood in place for extended periods, adjusted to the conditions around them, and responded to the requirements of the routine, all while maintaining awareness of their surroundings and the expectations placed upon them. And within these conditions, interactions with others continued to play a role, as individuals observed the behavior of those around them, exchanged brief words or gestures when possible, and learned from the experience of others who had already adapted to the routine, creating a process of gradual adjustment that unfolded over time. And as the morning advanced, the next stages of the day began to take shape, with groups being directed toward their respective tasks or areas, marking the transition from assembly to activity. And within this transition, the routine of the camp revealed its broader structure, as each part of the day was connected to the next, forming a continuous sequence that defined daily life. And for the newcomers, this realization marked an important step in their understanding of the environment, as the uncertainty of arrival gave way to a more defined awareness of how the camp functioned, and how they would be expected to function within it. And as they moved forward into the activities of the day, the experience of the first morning remained significant, serving as an introduction to the patterns and expectations that would continue to shape their time in Birkenau. And in this way, the morning routine became more than just the beginning of a day, but a foundational element of the camp structure, one that established the rhythm of life and the framework within which all other experiences would occur. Chapter 4, Segment 2. Roll Call, Standing for Hours. Following the initial assembly of the morning, one of the most defining elements of the daily routine in Birkenau began to unfold, a process known as roll call, where all prisoners were required to stand in formation while being counted and accounted for. And for those experiencing it for the first time, the procedure seemed straightforward at first, as groups remained lined up in rows, standing in the open space between the barracks, waiting for the count to begin. Yet as time passed, the true nature of this routine became more apparent, as the duration extended far beyond what might have been expected, turning what appeared to be a simple administrative task into a prolonged period of stillness and endurance. And within this setting, individuals were expected to remain in place, maintaining their position in the line, often with little movement as the count was conducted, repeated, and verified, creating a rhythm that was both methodical and unyielding. And for those standing in formation, the physical experience of this process became increasingly noticeable, as the need to remain still for extended periods placed strain on the body, particularly after the exhaustion of the previous day and night. And yet the expectation to remain in position was clear, reinforced by the presence of guards and the structured nature of the procedure. And as the minutes turned into longer stretches of time, the atmosphere of the roll call shifted, from initial alertness to a more sustained endurance as individuals adjusted to the conditions, focusing on maintaining balance, conserving energy, and following the unspoken rhythm of the group. And within this environment, the sense of time became altered, as the absence of clear markers for the beginning and end of the process made it difficult to gauge how long it would continue, leading to a perception of time that was shaped by the experience of waiting rather than by measurable intervals. And as the count proceeded, any discrepancies or interruptions could lead to repetition, extending the duration further and reinforcing the importance placed on accuracy within the system. And for those standing in the lines, this repetition added another layer to the experience, as the anticipation of completion was repeatedly delayed, requiring continued patience and endurance. And within these moments, individuals often turned inward, focusing on their own thoughts, memories, or strategies for maintaining composure, while also remaining aware of their surroundings and the need to respond to any changes in the process. And as the roll call continued, the collective experience of the group became more pronounced, as everyone shared the same conditions, the same expectations, and the same prolonged stillness, creating a sense of unity and experience, even as each individual navigated it in their own way. And in this way, the roll call became more than just a procedural requirement, but a defining feature of daily life in Birkenau, one that introduced the realities of endurance, discipline, and the structured control that characterized the camp, marking a continuation of the routine that had begun with the morning assembly and extending it into a prolonged and demanding experience that would be repeated day after day. As the roll call continued into its later stages, the physical and mental demands of standing for extended periods became more deeply felt, particularly for those who were still adjusting to the conditions of the camp, and within the lines, small movements, shifting weight from one foot to another, adjusting posture, or briefly glancing around, became subtle ways of coping with the strain, though these movements were often limited by the expectation to remain orderly and still. And as the process unfolded, the environment itself played a role in shaping the experience, as the open space where the roll call took place exposed individuals to the elements, whether it be the chill of early morning air, the presence of wind, or other conditions that added to the physical challenge of standing in place. And within this setting, the shared experience of the group continued to evolve, as individuals became more attuned to the collective rhythm of the lines, the pauses in the counting, the moments of repetition, and the eventual progression toward completion. And as time passed, the anticipation of the end of the roll call grew, though it remained uncertain when that moment would arrive, creating a dynamic where expectation and endurance coexisted, each influencing how the experience was perceived and managed. And for those who had already spent time in the camp, this routine was familiar, part of the established rhythm of daily life, while for newcomers, it served as a powerful introduction to the realities of the system, demonstrating how even routine procedures could extend into prolonged and demanding experiences. And as the final stages of the roll call approached, the lines began to show subtle signs of transition, as the counting reached its conclusion and the structure of the formation prepared to shift. And when the process was finally completed, the change was marked not by a dramatic announcement but by a gradual release from the requirement to stand, as groups were directed to move, to reorganize, or to proceed to the next stage of the day's activities. And within this transition, the contrast between stillness and movement became evident, as the prolonged period of standing gave way to renewed motion, allowing individuals to step out of their positions and continue with the routine. And as they did so, the experience of the roll call remained present, both physically and mentally, as a reminder of the demands of the environment and the expectations of the system. And in this way, the roll call became a central element of the daily routine in Birkenau, shaping not only the structure of the day but also the experience of those within it, reinforcing the discipline, endurance, and collective nature of life in the camp, and marking another step in the ongoing process of adaptation to the conditions that define their existence. Chapter 4, Segment 3. Assigned Labor, the Beginning of Work. After the completion of roll call, the structured stillness of the morning gave way to movement once again, as groups of prisoners were directed toward the next phase of the day, the beginning of assigned labor, and for those experiencing this transition for the first time, it marked a significant shift from observation and endurance into active participation within the system of the camp, as individuals were no longer simply standing in formation or moving through procedures, but were now being organized into work groups, each assigned to specific tasks that contributed to the functioning of Birkenau. And as these groups formed, the process reflected the same structured approach seen in earlier stages, with individuals being arranged according to categories, directed by guards or overseers, and guided toward designated areas where their work would take place. And within this organization, the scale of the camp became even more apparent, as the variety of tasks and locations revealed the complexity of the system, with different sections of the camp serving different purposes, all interconnected yet distinct in their function. And as the newly formed work groups began to move, the physical environment shifted once more, as they walked along paths that led away from the barracks and assembly areas, passing through sections of the camp that had not yet been fully visible to them, and in doing so, they gained a broader perspective of the space, observing the arrangement of buildings, the placement of fences, and the presence of other groups already engaged in their tasks, each detail contributing to a growing understanding of how the camp operated on a daily basis. And for many, this movement into work areas was accompanied by a sense of anticipation mixed with uncertainty, as the nature of the tasks ahead was not always clearly explained, leaving individuals to rely on observation and instruction to understand what was expected of them. And as they arrived at their assigned locations, the process of beginning work unfolded with a similar emphasis on efficiency and order. As instructions were given, positions were assigned, and the rhythm of activity began to take shape, and within this rhythm, the physical demands of the work became evident, as tasks often required sustained effort, coordination, and attention, and for those who had just arrived, the adjustment to these demands was immediate, as they moved from a state of waiting and observation into one of continuous activity, and as the hours of the day stretched ahead, the beginning of labor marked the introduction to a central aspect of life within Birkenau, one that would define not only the structure of each day but also the experience of the individuals within it, shaping their routines, their interactions, and their understanding of the system they had entered. And in this way, the transition from roll call to work became a defining moment, where the expectations of the camp were translated into action, and where the role of each individual within the system began to take form through the tasks they were assigned and the environment in which they carried them out. As the work period continued, the experience of assigned labor became more fully realized, as individuals settled into the rhythm of their tasks, learning through repetition, observation, and occasional instruction how to carry out what was expected of them. And within this process, the physical and mental aspects of the work began to intertwine, as the effort required to perform the tasks was accompanied by the need to remain attentive, to follow directions accurately, and to adapt to the pace set by the group or overseers, creating an environment where concentration and endurance were both essential. And as the hours passed, the sense of time once again shifted, as the progression of the day was measured not by personal activities or choices, but by the continuation of work, the structure of the schedule, and the transitions between different stages of the routine. And within this framework, the collective nature of the experience became more pronounced, as individuals worked alongside others, sharing the same tasks, the same conditions, and the same expectations, and while direct communication was often limited, the presence of others provided a sense of shared experience, as movements, actions, and responses became coordinated within the group, creating a rhythm that was both individual and collective. And as the work continued, the physical environment of the camp remained a constant presence, with its structures, boundaries, and layout shaping how tasks were carried out and how individuals moved within the space, reinforcing the sense that every aspect of the experience was influenced by the design and organization of Birkenau. And for those new to the camp, this period of labor served as a deeper introduction to the realities of daily life, as it revealed not only the expectations placed upon them but also the way in which the system functioned as a whole, integrating each individual into its operation through the roles they performed. And as the day moved toward its later stages, the anticipation of the next transition, whether it be a pause, a return to the barracks, or another stage of the routine, began to emerge, though it remained defined by the structure of the camp rather than by personal choice. And in this way, the experience of assigned labor became a central element of life within Birkenau, shaping the rhythm of the day, the use of time, and the interaction between individuals and the system. And as the first experiences of work came to an end, they left a lasting impression, marking the beginning of a routine that would repeat, evolve, and continue to define the daily existence of those within the camp, reinforcing the structured and controlled nature of the environment and the role of each person within it. Chapter 5, Segment 1. The Barracks Life, Living Among Hundreds. As the rhythm of daily labor and routine began to settle into a pattern, the barracks emerged as the central space where prisoners spent their limited moments away from structured activity. Yet even this space, which might have been expected to offer some sense of rest or privacy, was shaped by the same conditions of crowding, organization, and limitation that defined the rest of Birkenau. And for those newly assigned to a barack, the experience of entering and living within it became an essential part of understanding life inside the camp, as the structure itself, long and narrow, was designed to house a large number of individuals within a confined area, with rows of wooden bunks or platforms stacked in tiers, creating layers of sleeping spaces that extended along the interior. And as individuals found their assigned places, often shared with others, the reality of limited personal space became immediately apparent, as each person had only a small area within which to rest, store what little they possessed, and exist during the hours when they were not engaged in work or assembly. And within this environment, the presence of many individuals in close proximity created a constant awareness of others, as movement, sound, and activity were shared experiences that filled the space, making solitude rare and often impossible. And as the newcomers adjusted to these conditions, they began to observe the routines and behaviors that had developed among those who had already been living in the barracks, learning through observation how to navigate the space, how to organize their limited belongings, and how to adapt to the expectations of communal living. And within this process, small patterns began to emerge as individuals established informal ways of managing the shared environment, whether through cooperation, quiet communication, or simply by following the established rhythm of the group. And as the day's activities came to an end and prisoners returned to the barracks, the space transformed once again, shifting from a relatively quiet resting area into a place of collective presence. As people entered, settled into their places, and began the process of winding down from the demands of the day, and within these moments, the barracks became a space where the experiences of the day were carried inward, as individuals reflected, spoke quietly with others, or simply rested in silence. And for many, this period provided a brief opportunity to reconnect with a sense of personal awareness, even within the constraints of the environment, as the absence of external tasks allowed for moments of thought, memory, and internal reflection. And yet even in his space, the structure of the camp remained present, as the conditions of the barack, the expectations of behavior, and the limited time available all reinforced the controlled nature of life within Birkenau, shaping not only how individuals lived but also how they experienced these moments of relative stillness. And, in this way, the barracks became more than just a place to sleep, but a central component of daily life, where the realities of the camp were experienced in a concentrated and continuous manner, and where the balance between collective existence and individual experience was constantly negotiated within the confines of a shared and structured space. As time passed and the experience of living within the barracks continued, the dynamics of communal life became more defined, as individuals adapted to the presence of others and the limitations of the environment, developing ways to navigate the challenges of shared space while maintaining a sense of personal identity within it. And within this process, relationships, whether brief or more sustained, began to form as individuals interacted with those around them, sometimes offering assistance, sharing observations, or simply acknowledging one another's presence, creating small moments of connection that provided a sense of continuity within the broader structure of the camp. And these interactions, though often subtle, contributed to the social fabric of the barracks, shaping how individuals experienced their surroundings and how they responded to the conditions of communal living. And as the days progressed, the routines associated with the barracks became more familiar, as individuals learned when to return, how to prepare for rest, and how to organize their limited time within the space, creating a rhythm that complemented the broader routine of the camp. And within this rhythm, the barracks served as a place where the physical demands of the day could be momentarily set aside, even if the environment itself did not provide comfort in the traditional sense. And as evening turned into night, the transition within the barracks reflected a gradual shift from activity to rest. As conversations quieted, movements slowed, and individuals settled into their places, preparing for the limited sleep that the conditions allowed. And yet even in this quieter state, the presence of many people within a confined space meant that complete silence was rare, as the subtle sounds of the environment, breathing, shifting, occasional whispers, continued to create a shared auditory backdrop, and for those within the barracks, this constant presence of others became a defining aspect of their experience, shaping not only how they slept but also how they perceived their surroundings. As the awareness of being part of a collective remained present even in moments of rest, and as the cycle of day and night repeated, the barracks continued to play a central role in daily life, serving as both a physical space and a shared environment where the realities of the camp were experienced collectively, and where individuals navigated the balance between adaptation and endurance, finding ways to exist within the structure while maintaining their own sense of self. And in this way, life within the barracks became an integral part of the broader experience of Birkenau, reflecting the conditions, constraints, and human responses that defined life within the camp, and marking another stage in the ongoing process of adjustment to the environment and the system that governed it. Chapter 5, Segment 2. Food and Hunger, the Daily Rations. As the rhythm of life inside Birkenau continued to take shape, one of the most central and constantly felt aspects of daily existence became the system of food distribution, a process that, like every other part of camp life, was structured, regulated, and repeated with consistency, yet experienced by each individual in a deeply personal way. And for those newly arrived, the first encounters with this system revealed not only how food was provided, but also how it shaped the daily routine, the physical condition of the prisoners, and the way they perceived time itself, as meals became one of the few predictable markers within an otherwise controlled and demanding environment. And as the day progressed from morning assembly and labor into the moments when food was distributed, the anticipation of these intervals began to grow, not simply as a break in activity, but as a necessary part of sustaining energy and continuing through the demands of the day. And within this system, the distribution of food was carried out in a manner that emphasized efficiency and uniformity, with groups receiving their rations according to established procedures, often involving the use of shared containers or designated areas where food was handed out. And for those experiencing this for the first time, the process required attention and adaptation, as individuals learned how to position themselves, how to receive their portion, and how to manage it within the constraints of the environment. And, as they did so, the physical nature of the rations became apparent, as the portions were limited and consistent, designed to be distributed across a large number of people. And within this context, the act of receiving food took on a significance that extended beyond the immediate moment, as it became part of the broader experience of survival within the camp, shaping how individuals thought about their daily routine, their energy, and their ability to continue through the tasks assigned to them. And as the groups returned to their barracks or designated areas to consume their rations, the atmosphere often shifted slightly, as the focus of activity turned inward, toward the act of eating, and within these moments, the shared experience of hunger and sustenance created a collective awareness, as individuals engaged in the same action at the same time, each managing their portion in a way that reflected their own needs and circumstances. And as this process repeated day after day, the system of food distribution became deeply integrated into the rhythm of life in Birkenau, influencing not only the physical condition of the prisoners but also their perception of time, as the intervals between meals marked the progression of the day, creating a structure that, while limited, provided a sense of continuity within the broader routine of the camp. And in this way, the experience of food and hunger became a defining element of daily life, shaping both the practical and emotional aspects of existence within Birkenau and reinforcing the interconnected nature of the camp systems, where each part of the routine influenced the others, creating a complex and structured environment in which individuals lived and adapted. As the days passed and the routine of food distribution became more familiar, the experience of hunger began to take on a more constant presence, shaping not only the physical state of the prisoners but also their thoughts, behaviors, and interactions, as the limited nature of the rations meant that the need for sustenance was never fully satisfied, creating an ongoing awareness that extended beyond the moments of eating and into the rest of the day. And within this context, individuals developed different ways of responding to and managing this experience, as some focused on preserving their portion for as long as possible, while others consumed it more quickly, each approach reflecting a personal strategy for coping with the conditions. And as these patterns emerged, they became part of the daily rhythm, influencing how individuals approached the distribution of food, how they organized their time around it, and how they interacted with others within the shared environment of the barracks and work areas. And within these interactions, the presence of hunger often shaped communication, as conversations, when they occurred, might revolve around the experience of the day, the anticipation of the next meal, or the observations of others, creating a shared understanding that connected individuals through a common experience, even as each person navigated it in their own way. And as the routine continued, the physical effects of limited rations became more noticeable, influencing energy levels, movement, and overall endurance, particularly during periods of labor, where the demands of the tasks required sustained effort. And within this dynamic, the relationship between food, work, and rest became more clearly defined, as each element influenced the others, creating a cycle that shaped the daily experience. And as evening approached and the final distribution of food for the day took place, the transition into the night carried with it the awareness of the hours ahead, where the absence of further sustenance would extend until the next morning, reinforcing the cyclical nature of the routine and the role of food within it. And within the barracks, the act officiating in the evening often marked one of the final activities before rest, creating a moment where individuals could briefly focus on themselves, even within the shared environment, before the transition into sleep. And as the cycle repeated from one day to the next, the experience of food and hunger became deeply embedded in the reality of life within Birkenau, shaping not only the physical condition of the prisoners but also their perception of time, their interactions with others, and their understanding of the system in which they lived. And in this way, the daily rations, though limited in quantity, held a central place in the structure of the camp, influencing every aspect of life and serving as a constant reminder of the conditions that define their existence. Chapter 5, Segment 3. Illness and Survival, the Struggle to Endure. As the days in Birkenau continued to follow their structured rhythm, another reality gradually became more visible to those living within the camp: the presence of illness and the constant challenge of maintaining physical strength under difficult conditions. And for the newly arrived prisoners, this awareness often began subtly, through observation of others in the barracks or work groups, noticing individuals who moved more slowly, who appeared weakened, or who struggled to keep pace with the demands of daily routine. And within these observations, the connection between the environment and physical condition became increasingly clear, as the combination of limited rest, demanding labor, and restricted rations created circumstances in which maintaining health was a continuous challenge. And as this realization took shape, individuals became more aware of their own physical state, paying closer attention to signs of fatigue, discomfort, or illness, recognizing that these factors could influence their ability to participate in the routine and remain within the structure of the camp. And within the barracks, the shared living space contributed to this awareness, as the close proximity of many individuals meant that the condition of one person could be observed by others, creating a collective understanding of how health and endurance played a role in daily life. And as the routine continued, the presence of illness was not always marked by dramatic events but often by gradual changes as individuals adapted to their circumstances, sometimes finding ways to conserve energy, to adjust their movements, or to rely on the support of others when possible. And within this environment, the concept of survival took on a practical and immediate meaning, as each day required the ability to meet the expectations of the routine, to participate in work, and to maintain enough strength to continue. And as individuals navigated these challenges, they often developed personal strategies, whether through pacing themselves during tasks, focusing on conserving energy during periods of rest, or observing the behavior of others who had adapted to the conditions, learning from their experience, and applying it to their own situation. And as the days progressed, the interplay between the physical demands of the environment and the need to endure became a central aspect of life within Birkenau, shaping how individuals approached each part of the routine and how they understood their place within the system. And within this context, The presence of illness served as both a reminder of the challenges of the environment and as a factor that influenced daily decisions, interactions, and perceptions, reinforcing the reality that survival within the camp was not only about following instructions but also about navigating the physical and mental demands of the conditions. And in this way, the experience of illness and the effort to endure became deeply integrated into the daily life of the prisoners, shaping their understanding of the environment and their approach to each new day. As the experience of illness and endurance continued to unfold within the camp, the ways in which individuals responded to these challenges became more varied and more defined, as each person navigated their circumstances according to their own condition, resources, and understanding of the environment. And within this process, the role of observation remained significant, as individuals learned to recognize patterns, to identify moments when rest might be possible, or to adjust their approach to work in ways that allowed them to conserve energy, even within the constraints of the system. And as these adaptations developed, they contributed to a broader understanding of how to exist within the camp, not by changing the structure itself, but by finding ways to operate within it. And within the barracks, the shared experience of illness and recovery created moments of connection, as individuals sometimes offered small forms of support, whether through brief words, gestures, or the sharing of space, reinforcing the sense that even within a structured and controlled environment, human interactions continued to play a role in shaping the experience. And as time passed, the relationship between health, routine, and survival became more clearly defined, as individuals came to understand that their ability to continue depended on a balance between meeting the demands of the system and maintaining their own physical and mental strength. And within this balance, the daily routine served as both a challenge and a framework, providing the structure within which individuals had to operate while also setting the conditions that influenced their well-being. And as the cycle of days continued, the presence of illness remained a constant element of life within Birkenau, shaping not only the physical experience of the prisoners but also their perception of time, as each day carried with it need to endure, to adapt, and to continue. And within this ongoing process, the concept of survival evolved from a simple goal into a continuous effort, one that required awareness, resilience, and the ability to navigate the complexities of the environment. And as individuals moved through the days and nights of the camp, this effort became a defining aspect of their experience, shaping how they approached each moment and how they understood their place within the system. And in this way, the struggle to endure became not just a response to the conditions of Birkenau, but a central part of life. Within it, influencing every aspect of daily existence and reinforcing the interconnected nature of the challenges faced by those who lived within the camp. Chapter 6, Segment 1. The Guards and Authority, the Presence of Control. As the days inside Birkenau continued to follow their structured rhythm, another element of camp life became increasingly clear to those who had recently arrived: the constant and visible presence of authority, embodied in the guards and the system they represented. And this presence was not confined to a single moment or location, but extended across every aspect of the environment, shaping movement, behavior, and interaction in ways that were both direct and subtle. And for the newcomers, the awareness of this authority began on the ramp, where instructions had been given and lines had been formed. But as they moved deeper into the camp and began to experience its routines, the role of the guards became more defined, as they observed how instructions were communicated, how order was maintained, and how the system operated with a consistency that reinforced its structure. And within this environment, the guards were positioned as figures who directed the flow of daily life, overseeing the assembly of groups, the progression of work, and the organization of the barracks, creating a framework in which every action was guided by external direction rather than personal choice. And as individuals moved through their daily routines, the presence of these figures remained constant, whether at roll call, during labor, or in the movement between different areas of the camp. And this constancy contributed to a sense of control that extended beyond individual interactions, becoming part of the atmosphere itself, as the awareness of being observed and directed influenced how individuals behaved, how they moved, and how they responded to the environment, and for those adjusting to this reality, the process involved learning to recognize the expectations associated with this authority, understanding when to act, when to remain still, and how to follow instructions in a way that aligned with the structure of the camp. And within this learning process, observation played a key role as individuals watched how others responded to the presence of guards, noting the patterns of behavior that had developed over time, and using these observations to guide their own actions. And as the days progressed, this awareness became more integrated into daily life, shaping not only outward behavior but also internal perception, as the presence of authority influenced how individuals understood their position within the system and how they navigated the environment. And within this context, the guards were not only individuals performing a role but also part of a larger structure that defined the camp, representing the system of control that governed every aspect of life in Birkenau. And as this understanding deepened, it became clear that the presence of authority was not limited to moments of direct interaction, but was embedded in the organization of the camp itself, influencing the layout of spaces, the sequence of routines, and the expectations placed upon each person, creating an environment where control was both visible and pervasive. And in this way, the experience of authority became a central aspect of daily life, shaping how individuals moved, acted, and perceived their surroundings within the structured world of Birkenau. As the awareness of authority became more firmly established, the ways in which individuals responded to this presence began to evolve, as they adapted to the expectations of the system and developed an understanding of how to navigate interactions within it. And within this process, the role of routine became increasingly important, as the repetition of daily activities provided a framework through which individuals could anticipate and respond to the presence of guards, recognizing patterns in how instructions were given, how movements were directed, and how order was maintained. And this familiarity, though limited, offered a form of predictability within an otherwise controlled environment, allowing individuals to align their actions with the expectations of the system. And as they did so, the relationship between authority and routine became more apparent, as each reinforced the other, creating a cycle in which the structure of the camp was maintained through both direct oversight and the established patterns of daily life. And within this cycle, the presence of guards continued to influence the atmosphere of the camp, not only through direct interaction but also through the awareness that their role represented, shaping how individuals perceived their surroundings and their own behavior within it. And as the days passed, this awareness became a constant factor in the experience of the prisoners, influencing decisions, movements, and interactions in ways that were often subtle yet significant. And within this environment, the concept of control extended beyond physical direction to include the psychological dimension of understanding one's place within the system, as individuals learned to interpret the expectations associated with authority and to adjust their behavior accordingly. And as this process continued, the presence of guards became integrated into the overall experience of life in Birkenau, no longer a separate or isolated element, but a defining feature of the environment that shaped every aspect of daily existence. And as individuals moved through their routines, from morning assembly to labor and back to the barracks, the influence of authority remained consistent, guiding the flow of the day and reinforcing the structure within which all activities took place. And in this way, the presence of guards and the system they represented became an essential part of understanding life inside the camp, providing insight into how the environment was organized, how it functioned, and how individuals adapted to it, marking another stage in the ongoing process of adjustment to the realities of Birkenau, where control, routine, and experience were interconnected in shaping the daily lives of those within the camp. Chapter 6, Segment 2. Orders and Discipline, Learning the System. As the days in Birkenau continued to unfold, the structured presence of authority became more deeply embedded in the daily experience of the prisoners, not only through the visible roll-off guards but also through the system of orders and discipline that governed every aspect of movement and behavior. And for those who had recently arrived, this system was not immediately understood in full, but rather revealed itself gradually through repeated exposure, as individuals encountered the same patterns. of instruction, response, and consequence across different parts of the day. And within this process, the importance of understanding and following orders became increasingly clear, as the routine of the camp depended on precise coordination, with each group expected to move, assemble, and act according to specific directions, creating a flow that connected one stage of the day to the next. And as individuals participated in this routine, they began to recognize the significance of timing, positioning, and response, learning when to move, when to remain still, and how to align their actions with the expectations of the system. And within this learning process, observation once again played a central role, as those who were new to the camp watched more experienced prisoners, noting how they responded to instructions, how they positioned themselves within lines, and how they navigated the transitions between different stages of the routine, using these observations as a guide for their own behavior. And as the repetition of these actions continued, a form of familiarity began to develop, not in the sense of comfort, but in the sense of understanding the structure and expectations that defined daily life. And within this familiarity, the role of discipline became more apparent, as the system relied on consistency in order to function effectively, requiring individuals to adapt their behavior to fit within its framework. And as they did so, the concept of discipline extended beyond external enforcement to include internal awareness, as individuals became more attuned to the expectations placed upon them and adjusted their actions accordingly, creating a form of alignment between personal behavior and the structure of the camp. And as the days progressed, this alignment became more integrated into the experience of daily life, shaping how individuals approached each part of the routine, from morning assembly to labor and back to the barracks. And within this process, the system of orders and discipline revealed itself as a central mechanism through which the camp operated, connecting the presence of authority to the actions of the prisoners, and creating a framework in which each individual's behavior contributed to the overall functioning of the environment. And in this way, learning the system became an essential part of adapting to life in Birkenau, as it provided the knowledge and awareness needed to navigate the structured and controlled conditions of the camp, marking another stage in the ongoing process of adjustment and understanding. As the understanding of orders and discipline deepened, the ways in which individuals interacted with the system became more refined, as they developed a greater awareness of how to respond effectively within the structured environment. And within this process, the repetition of daily routines continued to reinforce the patterns that defined the camp, as each day provided another opportunity to observe, to adapt, and to integrate the expectations of the system into personal behavior. And as this integration took place, the role of discipline became less about immediate reaction and more about ongoing awareness, as individuals anticipated the requirements of each stage of the day and adjusted their actions accordingly, creating a sense of continuity within the routine. And within this continuity, the relationship between individual and system became more clearly defined, as each person's actions were shaped by the structure of the camp, while also contributing to its overall operation. And as individuals moved through their tasks, their interactions with others, and their time within the barracks, the influence of this system remained present, guiding behavior and shaping the experience of daily life. And within this environment, moments of adjustment and learning continued to occur, as individuals encountered new situations, observed different responses, and refined their understanding of how the system functioned, creating an ongoing process of adaptation that extended beyond the initial days of arrival. And as this process unfolded, the concept of discipline became an integral part of the experience, not only as a requirement imposed by the system but also as a framework through which individuals navigated their environment, allowing them to respond to the demands of the camp in a way that aligned with its structure. And as the days turned into a sequence of repeated routines, the familiarity with orders and discipline provided a form of stability within the otherwise challenging conditions, offering a predictable pattern that, while controlled, allowed individuals to anticipate what would come next. And in this way, the system of orders and discipline became a defining feature of life in Birkenau, shaping how individuals acted, how they understood their surroundings, and how they adapted to the environment, reinforcing the interconnected nature of authority, routine, and experience, and marking another step in the ongoing process of learning and living within the structured world of the camp. Chapter 6, Segment 3. Fear and Uncertainty, Living Under Constant Pressure. As the structured routines of Birkenau became more familiar, another layer of the camp's reality began to settle more deeply into the daily experience of the prisoners. A persistent sense of uncertainty that existed alongside the visible order of the system, and for those who had recently arrived, this feeling did not always present itself immediately, as the initial days were filled with the need to understand procedures, to follow instructions, and to adapt to the physical environment. But as time passed and the repetition of routine created moments of reflection, the awareness of uncertainty began to grow, shaped by the lack of clear information about what lay ahead, the separation from family members, and the realization that the system operated according to its own rules, which were not always explained or predictable. And within this environment, the contrast between the structured nature of daily life and the underlying unpredictability created a complex experience, where individuals could anticipate certain parts of the day, such as roll call or labor, yet remained unsure about the broader trajectory of their situation. And as this awareness developed, it influenced how individuals perceived their surroundings, as even familiar routines were experienced with an underlying tension. A sense that while the immediate moment was defined, the future remained uncertain, and within this context, the presence of authority, the structure of the camp, and the conditions of daily life all contributed to a constant awareness that extended beyond physical experience into the psychological dimension, shaping how individuals thought, felt, and responded to their environment. And as they moved through their daily activities, this awareness manifested in subtle ways, in the careful attention to instructions, in the observation of others, and in the internal reflection that accompanied moments of stillness, as individuals sought to understand their situation and to find a sense of stability within it. And for many, this process involved balancing the need to focus on the present moment with the natural inclination to consider what might come next, creating a dynamic where immediate action and broader reflection coexisted, each influencing the other. And as the days continued, the accumulation of experiences, observations, and interactions contributed to a deeper understanding of the environment, though this understanding remained incomplete, shaped by the limitations of information and the complexity of the system. And within this incomplete understanding, the sense of uncertainty persisted, becoming an integral part of daily life, influencing not only how individuals approached their routines but also how they interpreted their experiences. And in this way, the combination of structure and uncertainty created a unique aspect of life in Birkenau, where the visible order of the camp existed alongside an underlying unpredictability, shaping the psychological landscape of those within it and contributing to the overall experience of living under constant pressure. As this sense of uncertainty continued to shape the daily experience, the ways in which individuals responded to it became an important aspect of adaptation, as each person developed their own approach to navigating the balance between the known and the unknown. And within this process, the role of routine once again became significant, as the repetition of daily activities provided a framework that offered a degree of predictability, allowing individuals to focus on the immediate tasks and expectations of the day even as the broader context remained uncertain. And as they engaged with this routine, the familiarity of certain patterns, morning assembly, labor, return to the barracks, created a rhythm that could be relied upon, at least in part, providing a sense of continuity within the larger environment. And within this rhythm, individuals often found ways to manage the psychological impact of uncertainty, whether through focusing on the present moment, observing the behavior of others, or maintaining internal reflections that helped them process their experiences. And as these strategies developed, they became part of the ongoing process of adaptation, shaping how individuals interacted with the environment and how they maintained their sense of self within it. And within the barracks, the shared experience of uncertainty sometimes created moments of quiet connection, as individuals, though often limited in communication, could recognize in one another the same questions, the same reflections, and the same efforts to understand their situation, creating a subtle sense of shared awareness that existed alongside the structured routine. And as time passed, the interplay between structure and uncertainty became more deeply embedded in the experience of life within Birkenau. As individuals continued to navigate the demands of the system while also managing the lack of clarity about what lay beyond the immediate moment, and within this ongoing process, the concept of living under constant pressure became more defined, not as a single event or condition, but as a continuous state shaped by the combination of routine, authority, and uncertainty, influencing every aspect of daily life, from the way individuals moved and worked to the way they thought and perceived their surroundings. And as the days continued to unfold, this state became a central feature of the experience, shaping the psychological and emotional landscape of the camp, and reinforcing the reality that life in Birkenau was defined not only by its visible structures and routines, but also by the underlying uncertainty that accompanied them, creating a complex and multifaceted environment in which individuals lived, adapted, and endured. Chapter 7, Segment 1. Moments of Humanity, Small Acts of Kindness. Amid the structured routines and controlled environment of Birkenau, where daily life was defined by order, labor, and limitation, there existed another dimension of experience that was less visible but deeply significant: the presence of small moments of humanity that emerged within the constraints of the system. And for those living within the camp, these moments were not part of any formal structure or routine, but rather arose spontaneously through individual actions, interactions, and choices, often subtle and brief, yet carrying a meaning that extended beyond their immediate context. And as the days progressed, the newcomers began to notice these moments, sometimes in the barracks, sometimes during work, or even in the spaces between structured activities, as individuals found ways to acknowledge one another, to offer a gesture, or to share a small part of what they had, creating a sense of connection that existed alongside the impersonal nature of the camp system. And within this environment, where much of daily life was governed by external direction, these acts of kindness stood out precisely because they were not required, not enforced, but chosen, reflecting the persistence of human interaction even within a highly structured and controlled setting. And as individuals observed and experienced these moments, they began to understand that while the system defined the framework of their lives, it did not entirely eliminate the possibility of personal connection. And within the barracks, these interactions often took the form of quiet exchanges: a few words spoken in a low voice, a gesture of assistance in organizing space, or the sharing of information that might help someone navigate the routine more effectively. And while these actions were often small in scale, they contributed to a sense of shared experience, reminding individuals that they were not alone in their situation. And as the routine of the camp continued, these moments of humanity became part of the texture of daily life, appearing intermittently yet consistently, offering brief instances of connection that contrasted with the broader environment. And for many, these interactions provided a form of support that, while limited, played a role in how they experienced their surroundings, shaping their perception of others and their understanding of life within the camp. And as these moments accumulated, they created a subtle but meaningful layer within the experience of Birkenau, one that existed alongside the structures of authority and routine, and that reflected the capacity for individuals to respond to one another in ways that were not defined by the system. And in this way, the presence of small acts of kindness became an important aspect of life within the camp, offering glimpses of connection and humanity within an environment that was otherwise characterized by control and limitation. As these moments of humanity continued to appear within the daily routine, their impact became more apparent, not in dramatic or overt ways, but through the gradual influence they had on how individuals experienced their environment and interacted with one another. And within this process, the significance of these acts lay not only in what was done, but in the context in which they occurred, as even the smallest gesture took on added meaning when it was carried out within a setting where such actions were not required and where resources, time, and energy were all limited. And as individuals encountered these moments, whether by receiving or offering them, they became part of a shared understanding that extended beyond words, a recognition of the presence of others and the possibility of connection within the structured framework of the camp. And within the barracks, this understanding often manifested in quiet forms of cooperation, as individuals adjusted to living in close proximity, finding ways to share space, to assist one another in small tasks, or to maintain a sense of order within the limited environment. And as these interactions continued, they contributed to the development of informal patterns of behavior, shaping how individuals related to one another and how they navigated the challenges of communal living. And beyond the barracks, during periods of labor or movement, similar moments could occur, as individuals exchanged brief words, offered a gesture of encouragement, or simply acknowledged one another's presence, creating a network of subtle connections that existed within the larger structure of the camp. And as time passed, these interactions became part of the ongoing process of adaptation, influencing how individuals perceived their situation and how they maintained a sense of self within it. And while the system of Birkenau remained constant in its structure and demands, these moments of humanity provided a counterpoint, a reminder that within the framework of control and routine, individual actions and choices still held meaning. And as the days continued to unfold, the presence of these acts contributed to a more nuanced understanding of life within the camp, one that recognized both the constraints of the environment and the capacity for individuals to respond to one another in ways that reflected shared experience and understanding. And in this way, the moments of kindness and connection, though often brief and understated, became an integral part of the experience of Birkenau, shaping the social and emotional landscape of the camp and offering a perspective that extended beyond the visible structures of authority and routine, highlighting the enduring presence of humanity even within the most controlled and challenging conditions. Chapter 7, Segment 2: Communication and Whispered Networks, Sharing Information. Within the structured and closely controlled environment of Birkenau, where movement, routine, and behavior were guided by the system, communication did not disappear, but instead adapted, taking on quieter, more subtle forms that allowed individuals to exchange information, observations, and understanding within the limits of the camp. And for those who had recently arrived, this aspect of life was not immediately visible, as the initial focus was on following instructions and adjusting to the routine. Yet as time passed and individuals became more attuned to their surroundings, they began to notice that communication existed beneath the surface of daily activity, often in the form of brief conversations, exchanged glances, or small gestures that carried meaning without drawing attention. And within the barracks, this form of communication was particularly evident, as individuals shared space in close proximity, creating opportunities for quiet interaction, where information could be passed in low voices or through simple signals. And these exchanges often centered on practical knowledge, such as understanding the routine, anticipating the sequence of events in the day, or learning how to navigate specific aspects of the camp. And for newcomers, this information was especially valuable, as it provided insights that were not formally explained, helping them to adapt more quickly to the environment and to avoid confusion during the structured processes of daily life. And as these interactions continued, a form of informal network began to take shape, not organized in a formal sense, but emerging naturally through repeated contact and shared experience, as individuals learned who might have information, who had been in the camp longer, and who could offer guidance or context. And within this network, the flow of information was not constant but occurred in moments, often during transitions between activities, in the brief intervals before or after routine tasks, or in the quiet periods within the barracks. And as these moments were used to exchange knowledge, they contributed to a growing collective understanding of the environment, shaping how individuals perceived the camp and how they responded to its demands. And as this process unfolded, the role of communication became more significant, not only as a means of sharing information but also as a way of maintaining connection, as the act of speaking, listening, or signaling created a sense of interaction that existed alongside the structured and often impersonal nature of the system, and within this context, the whispered networks of communication became an essential part of life within Birkenau, allowing individuals to navigate the environment with greater awareness and share in a collective process of understanding, even within the constraints imposed by the camp. As these forms of communication continued to develop, their influence extended beyond the immediate exchange of information, shaping how individuals related to one another and how they interpreted their experiences within the camp. And within this process, the act of sharing knowledge became a way of creating a sense of continuity, as individuals connected their own observations with those of others, building a broader picture of the environment that was informed by multiple perspectives. And as this shared understanding grew, it contributed to the process of adaptation, allowing individuals to anticipate certain aspects of the routine, to recognize patterns, and to respond more effectively to the demands of the system. And within the barracks, these exchanges often took place in quiet moments, where the absence of direct oversight allowed for brief conversations or gestures that conveyed meaning without drawing attention. And as these interactions became more familiar, they formed a subtle but important layer of social interaction, one that existed alongside the formal structure of the camp and provided a different dimension to daily life. And beyond the barracks, during work or movement, communication continued in similar forms, often limited to short exchanges or signals, yet still contributing to the overall flow of information. And as individuals moved through the different stages of the day, these networks of communication remained active, adapting to the conditions and opportunities available. And as time passed, the significance of these networks became more apparent, as they played a role not only in helping individuals navigate the practical aspects of life in the camp, but also in maintaining a sense of shared experience, as the exchange of information created connections between individuals, reinforcing the idea that while the system defined the structure of the environment, the experience within it was shaped by the interactions and relationships that developed over time. And as these interactions continued, they became an integral part of the daily routine, influencing how individuals understood their surroundings and how they engaged with one another. And in this way, the whispered networks of communication became a vital aspect of life within Birkenau, providing a means of sharing knowledge, fostering connection, and supporting the ongoing process of adaptation within a structured and controlled environment, highlighting the ways in which individuals found opportunities for interaction and understanding even within the limitations imposed by the camp. Chapter 7, Segment 3. Holding onto identity, memory, and inner strength. As life inside Birkenau continued to follow its rigid and repetitive structure, shaped by routine, authority, and limitation, another quieter and deeply personal process unfolded within the individuals who lived there: the effort to hold onto a sense of identity in an environment that continually reduced personal distinction. And for many, this process did not take place in visible actions or spoken declarations, but rather within the inner space of thought, memory, and reflection, where the experiences of the past remained present even as the conditions of the present demanded adaptation. And as the days passed, individuals found themselves returning, often silently, to memories of their lives before arrival, recalling places, people, routines, and moments that had defined their sense of self. And within these recollections, there existed a contrast between the life they had known and the environment they now inhabited. Yet these memories also served as a connection to something beyond the immediate conditions, a way of maintaining continuity with their own history, even as the external system of the camp sought to impose a new structure upon them. And as this process unfolded, the act of remembering became more than just reflection. It became a way of preserving identity, of maintaining a sense of who they were beyond the roles and categories assigned within the camp. And within the barracks, during moments of relative stillness, or even during the rhythm of labor, these internal reflections could surface, sometimes triggered by small details: a familiar word, a shared glance, or a quiet moment that allowed the mind to move beyond the immediate surroundings. And as individuals engaged with these memories, they often did so privately, without outward expression, as the environment did not always allow for open sharing. Yet even in silence, these internal experiences played a significant role in shaping how they perceived themselves and their situation. And for some, the connection to identity was also maintained through small, subtle actions, such as the way they organized their space, the way they spoke when possible, or the way they responded to thirst, each choice reflecting a personal sense of self that existed alongside the structure of the camp. And as the days continued, this inner dimension of experience became increasingly important, as it provided a counterbalance to the external conditions, allowing individuals to maintain a sense of continuity and personal meaning within an environment that was otherwise defined by uniformity and control. And in this way, the effort to hold on to identity became an essential part of life within Birkenau, shaping how individuals navigated their daily experiences and how they understood their place within the system, not only as participants in the routine but as individuals with histories, memories, and a sense of self that extended beyond the immediate reality of the camp. As this internal process of maintaining identity continued, it became intertwined with the broader experience of adaptation and endurance, as individuals found ways to integrate their memories and sense of self into the daily rhythm of life within the camp, creating a balance between the demands of the present and the connection to the past. And within this balance, the concept of inner strength began to take shape, not as a visible or measurable quality, but as a quiet resilience that allowed individuals to continue through the routines, to respond to the conditions, and to maintain a sense of purpose or awareness even within a highly structured environment. And as this resilience developed, it was often supported by the presence of others, as shared experiences, even when not openly discussed, created a sense of understanding that reinforced the idea that each person carried their own internal world, their own memories and identity, within the collective environment of the camp. And within the barracks, this shared awareness sometimes manifested in subtle ways, as individuals recognized in one another the same effort to hold on to something beyond the immediate conditions, creating a quiet form of connection that did not rely on extensive communication but was understood through presence and observation. And as time passed, the role of memory and identity remained central to how individuals experienced their surroundings, influencing their thoughts, their responses, and their perception of the routine. As the repetition of daily life did not erase the past, but instead existed alongside it, creating a layered experience where the present and the remembered coexisted, each shaping the other. And within this layered experience, individuals continued to navigate their environment, adapting to the demands of the camp while maintaining an internal sense of continuity. And as the days unfolded into weeks and beyond, this process became an integral part of survival, not only in a physical sense, but in a broader understanding of what it meant to endure within such an environment. As the preservation of identity provided a form of stability that could not be taken away by external conditions, and in this way, the effort to hold on to identity and the development of inner strength became defining aspects of life within Birkenau, shaping the psychological and emotional experience of the prisoners and contributing to the complex and multifaceted reality of living within the camp, where the external structure and the internal world existed in constant interaction, each influencing how individuals understood themselves and their place within the environment. Chapter 8, Segment 1. Time inside the camp, days that felt endless. As life within Birkenau continued to follow its rigid and repetitive structure, the perception of time itself began to change for those living inside the camp, becoming less tied to the familiar markers of calendars, clocks, or personal schedules, and more defined by the routines, sequences, and conditions that shaped each day. And for those who had recently arrived, this shift was not immediate but developed gradually, as the initial days of adjustment gave way to a deeper awareness of how time was experienced within the camp. And within this environment, the day was divided not by personal choice but by the structured events of the routine: morning assembly, roll call, labor, food distribution, and return to the barracks, each stage marking a progression that was repeated with consistency, creating a cycle that defined the passage of time. And as individuals moved through this cycle, The repetition of these events began to blur the distinction between one day and the next, as the similarities in routine created a sense of continuity that made it difficult to identify specific moments or changes. And within this continuity, time could feel both extended and compressed, as certain periods, such as standing during roll call or performing labor, seemed to stretch, shaped by the physical and mental demands of the experience, while other moments, particularly those of rest or quiet reflection, passed more quickly, creating a dynamic where time was experienced not as a uniform flow but as a series of varied and often contrasting intervals. And as this perception developed, individuals began to rely on the structure of the routine as a way of understanding the passage of time, using the sequence of daily events as reference points, even as the broader sense of days, weeks, or months became less distinct. And within this framework, the concept of time became closely linked to experience, as the way a moment was perceived depended on the conditions in which it occurred, whether it was a period of physical exertion, waiting, or relative stillness. And as individuals adapted to this new understanding of time, they also adjusted their expectations, focusing more on the immediate stages of the day rather than on longer spans, as the structured environment encouraged attention to the present moment and the next step in the routine. And within this focus, the broader sense of time receded, replaced by a more immediate awareness of sequence and repetition. And as the days continued to unfold, this altered perception became an integral part of life within Birkenau, shaping how individuals experienced their surroundings, how they interpreted their routine, and how they understood the progression of their time within the camp. And in this way, time itself became another aspect of the environment, influenced by the structure of the system and the conditions of daily life, creating an experience that was distinct from anything they had known before, and that played a significant role in shaping their overall understanding of life within Birkenau. As this altered perception of time became more deeply established, the experience of living within the camp took on a different rhythm, one that was defined less by the passage of hours and more by the repetition of events. And within this rhythm, individuals often found themselves navigating a sense of continuity that extended across multiple days, as the routine created a pattern that repeated with little variation, making it difficult to distinguish one day from another. And as this pattern persisted, the awareness of time shifted further, with individuals sometimes measuring their experience in terms of completed routines rather than specific dates or durations, focusing on how many cycles of the day had passed rather than on how much time had elapsed in a conventional sense. And within this framework, the anticipation of certain moments, such as the end of the work period or the return to the barracks, became important markers within the day, providing a sense of progression and helping to structure the experience, even as the broader passage of time remained indistinct. And as individuals adapted to this rhythm, they also developed ways of managing their perception of time, often by focusing on immediate tasks, maintaining attention on the present moment, or using internal reflections to create a sense of continuity that extended beyond the routine. And within the barracks, moments of quiet offered opportunities for reflection, where individuals could consider their experiences, recall memories, or simply observe the passage of the day, creating a contrast between the structured activity of the routine and the more fluid experience of time within these moments. And as these experiences accumulated, they contributed to a deeper understanding of how time functioned within the camp, not as a fixed or external measure, but as something shaped by the environment, the routine, and the individual's perception. And as the days continued to pass, this understanding became more integrated into the experience of daily life, influencing how individuals approached each stage of the routine and how they interpreted their overall situation. And in this way, the experience of time in Birkenau became a defining aspect of life within the camp, shaping not only the structure of the day but also the internal experience of those living within it, creating a complex and multifaceted perception that reflected the interaction between the external system and the internal awareness of each individual, and marking another dimension of adaptation to the unique conditions of the camp, where even something as fundamental as time was transformed by the environment in which it was lived. Chapter 8, Segment 2. Nights in Birkenau. Silence, rest, and uncertainty. As the structured rhythm of the day gradually came to an end, and the final stages of the evening routine unfolded, the atmosphere within Birkenau began to shift in a way that was both noticeable and deeply felt by those inside the camp, as the movement, sound, and activity that had defined the daylight hours slowly gave way to a quieter, more subdued environment, and for many, this transition marked not only the conclusion of the day's labor and routine, but also the beginning of a different kind of experience, one shaped by stillness, reflection, and the uncertain nature of rest within the camp. And as individuals returned to the barracks, often moving in groups and following the established procedures, the sense of collective motion gradually settled into a more contained and inward-focused atmosphere, as each person found their place within the confined space, adjusting to the limited room, the shared conditions, and the presence of others who were navigating the same transition. And, within the barracks, the process of settling in for the night followed a pattern that, while familiar, still required adaptation, as individuals arranged themselves within the available space, often in close proximity to one another, creating an environment where personal space was limited and where the presence of others was constant. And as this process unfolded, the sounds of the day were gradually replaced by quieter forms of activity, soft movements, subdued conversations when possible, and the general hum of a space filled with people preparing for rest. And yet, even within this quieter environment, the experience of night in Birkenau was not simply one of calm or relief, as the conditions of the barracks, the physical and mental fatigue accumulated throughout the day, and the uncertainty of what the next day would bring all contributed to a complex and layered experience of nighttime. And for many, the act of resting was influenced by these factors, as the body sought recovery while the mind remained active, processing the events of the day and anticipating the continuation of the routine. And as individuals lay in their assigned spaces, often on shared or limited bedding, the awareness of their surroundings remained present, shaped by the proximity of others, the sounds within the barracks, and the overall atmosphere of the camp at night. And within this context, sleep, when it came, was often uneven, influenced by the physical environment and the internal state of each individual. And as the night progressed, periods of rest were interspersed with moments of wakefulness, where the mind returned to reflection, memory, or simple awareness of the surroundings. And within these moments, the quiet of the night created a space where thoughts could surface more clearly, where the absence of the day's activity allowed for a different kind of engagement with one's own experience. And as this pattern repeated night after night, the experience of nighttime in Birkenau became an integral part of life within the camp, shaping not only the physical process of rest, but also the psychological and emotional rhythm that accompanied the transition from day to night. And in this way, the nights within the camp were not merely a pause in activity, but a distinct phase of the daily cycle, defined by its own conditions, challenges, and forms of experience. As the hours of the night continued to unfold, the environment within the barracks settled into a deeper stillness, though never complete silence, as the presence of many individuals within a confined space ensured that some level of sound and movement persisted, creating a constant but subdued background that accompanied the night. And within this setting, the experience of rest remained varied, as each individual navigated the balance between physical exhaustion and mental awareness in their own way. And for some, the fatigue of the day allowed for periods of sleep that, even if interrupted, provided moments of recovery, while for others, the conditions of the environment and the activity of the mind made rest more difficult, leading to extended periods of wakefulness where the passage of time during the night was experienced more directly. And as these experiences unfolded, the night became a time where internal reflection often took on greater significance, as the relative quiet and reduced activity created an opportunity for individuals to engage with their thoughts in a way that was less accessible during the structured and demanding hours of the day. And within this reflective space, memories, observations, and personal interpretations of the experience within the camp could emerge, shaping how individuals understood their situation and their place within it. And as these reflections occurred, they were often private and internal, shaped by the conditions of the environment and the limited opportunities for open expression. And yet, even within this inward focus, there remained a shared dimension to the nighttime experience, as the collective presence of others, each navigating their own thoughts and rest, created a sense of quiet coexistence, where the individual and the collective were closely intertwined, and as the night progressed toward its later hours, the anticipation of the next day gradually began to reappear, as individuals became aware, consciously or unconsciously, of the approaching return to the routine, the morning assembly, and the continuation of the structured cycle that defined life within the camp. And this anticipation, combined with the experiences of the night, contributed to a continuous flow between the face-off day and night, where each influenced the other, and where the end of one day seamlessly transitioned into the beginning of the next. And as this cycle repeated over time, the nights in Birkenau became not only a period of rest, but also a crucial component of the overall experience of living within the camp, shaping how individuals recovered, reflected, and prepared for the continuation of their daily lives within the structured and controlled environment. And in this way, the nighttime experience, with its combination of stillness, uncertainty, and internal engagement, played a significant role in the broader understanding of life within Birkenau, highlighting the ways in which even the quieter moments of the day were deeply connected to the overall rhythm and reality of the camp. Chapter 8, Segment 3. Waiting and Uncertainty, Living Without Knowing. As the rhythm of days and nights in Birkenau continued to repeat with a structured and often predictable sequence, there remained an underlying element that could not be defined by routine alone, a constant presence that shaped the experience of every individual within the camp, and that was the condition of uncertainty, a state not tied to any specific moment, but woven into the fabric of daily life, influencing how each person perceived their surroundings, their future, and even the immediate passage of time. And unlike the routines that could be observed, learned, and anticipated, uncertainty existed in a more subtle and pervasive way, emerging in the spaces between actions, in the pauses between events, and in the quiet awareness that not everything could be known or predicted. And for those living within the camp, this sense of not knowing extended across many aspects of their experience, from the expectations of the next day's routine to the broader question of how long their situation would continue. And as individuals moved through the daily cycle, this uncertainty accompanied them, present in the background of their thoughts even as they engaged with the structured demands of the environment. And within this context, waiting became a central aspect of life, not always in a visible or defined form, but as a non-going condition, a continuous state of anticipation without a clear object, where individuals found themselves existing between moments, aware that something might change, yet without knowing when or how. And this experience of waiting was not limited to specific events such as roll calls or movements within the camp, but extended into the broader perception of time itself, as the repetition of routine created a sense of continuity, while the uncertainty introduced an element of unpredictability that disrupted any sense of complete stability. And as a result, individuals often found themselves navigating a balance between the known structure of their daily lives and the unknown aspects that lay beyond it. And within this balance, the mind played a significant role, as thoughts moved between observation of the present and contemplation of possibilities, creating an internal landscape that was shaped as much by uncertainty as by experience. And for many, this internal process became a way of engaging with the reality of the camp, as the inability to fully understand or predict their situation led to a heightened awareness of each moment, where even small changes or deviations from the routine could carry significance. And as this awareness developed, it influenced how individuals interpreted their surroundings, how they responded to events, and how they understood their own place within the system. And in this way, uncertainty became not just a condition of not knowing, but an active element of experience, shaping perception, thought, and the overall understanding of life within Birkenau. And as the days continued to pass, this state of waiting and uncertainty remained constant, a quiet but powerful presence that defined the space between the structured moments of the routine and contributed to the complex and layered reality of living within the camp. As this condition of uncertainty persisted over time, it began to influence not only the internal thoughts of individuals, but also the way they approached their daily lives and interactions within the camp, shaping a perspective that was attuned to both the immediate and the unknown. And within this perspective, individuals often adapted by focusing more closely on the present moment, directing their attention toward the tasks, routines, and interactions that were within their control, while allowing the broader uncertainties to remain in the background, not resolved, but acknowledged as part of the environment in which they lived. And this approach created a form of mental balance, where the known and the unknown coexisted, each informing the other without fully dominating the experience. And as individuals engaged with this balance, they developed ways of navigating the uncertainty that were often subtle and personal, such as maintaining routines within the larger routine, forming quiet connections with others, or using reflection as a means of processing their experience. And within the collective environment of the camp, this shared condition of uncertainty also created a form of common understanding, as each person, regardless of their specific role or situation, was subject to the same lack of complete knowledge about the future. And this shared experience contributed to a sense of connection that, while not always expressed openly, was present in the awareness that others were navigating similar questions and unknowns. And as time continued to unfold within the camp, the interplay between routine and uncertainty became one of the defining characteristics of life in Birkenau, shaping not only the external structure of the day, but also the internal experience of those living within it. And within this interplay, the act of waiting took on a deeper meaning, no longer simply a pause between events, but a continuous state of being, where individuals existed within a space that was both structured and undefined, predictable and uncertain. And as they moved through this space, they carried with them an awareness that extended beyond the immediate moment, a recognition of the limits of their knowledge and the presence of possibilities that could not be fully anticipated. And in this way, the experience of waiting and uncertainty became an integral part of the broader narrative of life within Birkenau, reflecting the complex relationship between control and unpredictability that defined the environment, and highlighting how individuals adapted not only to the physical conditions of the camp, but also to the psychological reality of living without clear answers, where the future remained open, unknown, and ever-present in the background of their daily lives. Chapter 9, Segment 1. The Structure of Control: How Order Was Maintained. As life within Birkenau continued to unfold within its repetitive and structured rhythm, the underlying system that sustained this order became increasingly visible to those who experienced it day after day, not always in direct or overt ways, but through the consistent patterns, expectations, and responses that shaped every aspect of the environment. And within this system, control was not limited to singular actions or isolated moments, but existed as a continuous framework that guided movement, behavior, and interaction, creating a sense of order that, while rigid, was also deeply integrated into the daily experience of the camp. And for individuals living within the structure, understanding how this order functioned became part of their adaptation, as the repetition of routines revealed not only what was expected, but also how the system maintained itself over time. And as the days passed, it became clear that control operated on multiple levels, from the visible organization of the camp, such as the arrangement of barracks, the timing of routines, and the presence of authority, to the more subtle influences on behavior and perception, where expectations and consequences shaped how individuals acted and responded within the environment. And within this layered structure, each part of the day contributed to the overall sense of order, as the sequence of events created a predictable pattern that reinforced the system. And as individuals moved through these sequences, they became both participants in and observers of the structure, recognizing how each action fit into the larger framework. And within this recognition, there was an awareness that the system relied on consistency, on the repeated execution of routines that, over time, became familiar and expected. And as this familiarity developed, it influenced how individuals approached their daily lives, as they learned to anticipate the progression of events and to align their actions with the structure of the routine. And In doing so, they became integrated into the system in a way that allowed it to function continuously, and as this process unfolded, the concept of control extended beyond external enforcement, becoming part of the internal experience of those within the camp, as the expectations of the system shaped not only what individuals did, but also how they thought about their actions, their surroundings, and their place within the environment. And within this context, the maintenance of order was not a static or isolated feature, but an ongoing process, sustained by the interaction between the structure of the camp and the responses of those living within it. And as individuals continued to navigate this environment, the presence of this system became an integral part of their experience, influencing how they perceived the camp, how they adapted to its conditions, and how they understood the nature of life within Birkenau, where order was not merely imposed, but continuously reinforced through the repetition of daily routines and the collective participation of those within the system. As this structured system of control continued to shape daily life, its influence extended into the smallest details of routine and interaction, creating an environment where order was maintained not only through visible organization, but also through the consistency of behavior that emerged over time. And within this environment, individuals often found themselves aligning their actions with the expectations of the system, not necessarily through conscious decision at every moment, but through the gradual development of habits and responses that reflected the structure in which they lived. And as these patterns became more established, they contributed to the stability of the system, as the predictability of behavior reinforced the predictability of the routine, creating a cycle where each element supported the other. And within this cycle, the role of observation became significant, as individuals learned not only from direct instruction or experience, but also from watching the actions of others, understanding how the system operated through the visible and repeated behaviors that defined daily life. And as this process of observation and adaptation continued, it created a shared understanding of the structure, where individuals, despite their different backgrounds and experiences, became familiar with the same patterns and expectations, contributing to a collective awareness of how the environment functioned. And within this collective awareness, the maintenance of order took on a broader dimension, as it was supported not only by the structure itself, but also by the ways in which individuals responded to it, reinforcing the system through their actions and interactions. And as time passed, this interplay between structure and behavior became more deeply embedded in the experience of life within the camp, shaping not only the external organization of the day, but also the internal perception of order and routine, as individuals came to understand their environment through the patterns that defined it. And within this understanding, there was a recognition of the consistency that underpinned the system, even as the broader context of their situation remained complex and multifaceted. And as individuals continued to navigate this environment, the structure of control remained a constant presence, influencing how they moved, how they interacted, and how they experienced their daily lives. And in this way, the maintenance of order within Birkenau was not simply a function of authority or design, but a dynamic and ongoing process that emerged from the interaction between the system and the individuals within it, creating a reality where control was both external and internal, visible and subtle, and deeply integrated into every aspect of life within the camp. Chapter 9, Segment 2. Authority and Presence, the Visible Faces of the System. As the structured system of control within Birkenau continued to define the rhythm of daily life, the presence of authority figures became one of the most visible and constant elements through which this system was experienced, shaping not only the external organization of the camp but also the internal awareness of those who lived within it. And for individuals moving through the routines of the day, the awareness of authority was not limited to specific moments of interaction, but existed as a continuous presence influencing behavior, perception, and the overall understanding of the environment. And within this context, authority was expressed not only through direct actions or instructions, but also through visibility, positioning, and the consistent reinforcement of the structure that governed the camp. And as individuals observed their surroundings, they became increasingly aware of how authority was embedded within the physical and organizational layout of the camp, From the arrangement of spaces to the timing off routines, each element contributing to a system where order was maintained through both presence and expectation. And within this system, the role of observation was significant, as individuals learned to interpret the signals of authority, understanding how to navigate their environment based on what they saw, heard, and experienced. And as this awareness developed, it became part of their adaptation, shaping how they moved through the camp, how they responded to instructions, and how they engaged with the routine. And within the daily cycle, moments of direct interaction with authority figures were often structured and predictable, occurring during specific phases such as roll calls or organized movements. Yet even outside of these moments, the influence of authority remained present, creating a background awareness that informed behavior at all times. And as individuals continued to experience this environment, they developed an understanding of how authority functioned within the system, recognizing the consistency with which it was applied and the role it played in maintaining order. And within this understanding, there was also an awareness of the distance that often existed between authority and those within the camp, as interactions were typically defined by structure rather than personal connection, reinforcing the sense that authority was part of the system itself rather than an individual relationship. And as this perception became more established, it contributed to a broader understanding of the camp as a structured environment where roles were clearly defined and where the presence of authority was an integral part of the daily experience, shaping not only what individuals did, but also how they perceived their surroundings and their place within the system. And in this way, the visible faces of authority became a key component of life within Birkenau, representing the structure that governed the camp and influencing the way individuals navigated their daily lives within it. As the presence of authority continued to shape the environment of Birkenau, its influence extended beyond direct observation into the internal experience of those living within the camp, creating a sense of awareness that accompanied individuals throughout their daily routines, even in moments where authority figures were not immediately visible. And within this context, the idea of presence became more than a physical reality, as it also took on a psychological dimension, where the understanding of authority and its role within the system influenced how individuals thought, acted, and responded to their surroundings. And as this awareness became more deeply integrated into daily life, it contributed to the overall structure of the camp, reinforcing the patterns of behavior and expectation that defined the routine. And within this environment, individuals often found themselves adjusting not only to the visible aspects of authority, but also to the anticipated responses that guided their actions, creating a dynamic where behavior was shaped by both direct experience and internalized understanding. And as this process unfolded, it became clear that the system of authority within the camp operated on multiple levels, combining visibility with consistency to create an environment where order was maintained through both external enforcement and internal adaptation. And within this system, the role of collective experience was also significant, as individuals shared a common understanding of how authority functioned, even if their specific interactions varied, and this shared awareness contributed to a broader sense of how the camp operated, as the patterns of authority were observed, interpreted, and understood by those within the environment. And as time passed, this understanding became part of the overall experience of life within Birkenau, shaping how individuals navigated their daily routines and how they interpreted the structure that surrounded them. And within this framework, the presence of authority remained a constant, influencing not only the organization of the camp but also the internal landscape of those living within it, where awareness, adaptation, and understanding combined to create a complex and multifaceted experience of life under a system defined by structure and control. And in this way, the visible and perceived presence of authority became an essential element of the environment, shaping both the external reality of the camp and the internal experiences of those who lived within it, contributing to the overall dynamic of life in Birkenau, where structure, observation, and adaptation were continuously intertwined. Chapter 9, Segment 3. Order and Routine, the System That Never Stopped. As the presence of authority and the structure of control continued to define life within Birkenau, These elements came together most clearly in the form of routine, a continuous, repeating system that shaped each day from beginning to end. And for those living within the camp, this routine was not simply a sequence of events, but the framework through which time, movement, and experience were organized, creating a sense of order that persisted regardless of individual circumstances. And as the days unfolded, the repetition of this routine became one of the most defining aspects of life within the camp, as it established a pattern that was followed with consistency, creating a rhythm that guided every action and interaction. And within this rhythm, each part of the day held a specific place, from the early morning assembly to the periods of labor, the distribution of food, and the return to the barracks, each stage contributing to a cycle that was repeated day after day. And as individuals moved through this cycle, they became increasingly familiar with its structure, learning to anticipate the sequence of events and to align their actions accordingly. And in doing so, they became integrated into the system in a way that allowed it to function continuously, as the routine depended not only on its design, but also on the participation of those within it. And as this process continued, the routine itself began to take on a presence that extended beyond individual moments, becoming a constant element of the environment, something that could be relied upon even as other aspects of the experience remained uncertain. And within this consistency, there was a sense of predictability that, while structured and unchanging, provided a framework through which individuals could understand their daily lives, as the repetition of events created a familiar pattern that defined the passage of time and the progression of each day. And as individuals adapted to this pattern, they developed ways of navigating it, focusing on the sequence of actions and the expectations associated with each stage. And within this focus, the routine became not only a structure imposed from outside, but also an internalized process that shaped how individuals approached their daily experience, influencing their perception of time, their responses to events, and their overall understanding of life within the camp. And as the days continued to pass, the routine remained constant, repeating with a consistency that reinforced the system of control and contributed to the maintenance of order. And in this way, the routine became the central mechanism through which the camp operated, shaping every aspect of daily life and creating an environment where order was maintained through repetition, structure, and the continuous interaction between the system and those living within it. As this system of routine continued to operate without interruption, its influence extended beyond the organization of the day into the deeper experience of those living within the camp, shaping not only what they did, but also how they perceived their environment and their place within it. And within this extended influence, the routine became a lens through which individuals understood their daily lives, as the repetition of actions and events created a framework that defined both the present moment and the anticipation of what would come next. And as individuals moved through this framework, they often found themselves thinking in terms of the routine, measuring their experience by the completion of tasks, the transition between stages, and the progression from one part of the day to another. And within this perspective, the broader sense of time became closely tied to the repetition of the cycle, as days were experienced not as distinct units, but as variations within a continuous pattern. And as this understanding developed, it contributed to a sense of continuity that was both stabilizing and limiting, as the predictability of the routine provided a structure for daily life while also reinforcing the boundaries of the environment. And within this balance, individuals adapted by focusing on the aspects of the routine that were within their awareness and control, using the structure as a guide for navigating their experience. And as this adaptation continued, it became clear that the routine was not only a mechanism of order, but also a central element of how life within the camp was experienced and understood, shaping both the external organization of the environment and the internal perception of those within it. And as the system continued to function, day after day, it reinforced the consistency of the structure, creating a reality where the routine itself became a defining feature of life within Birkenau, influencing how individuals thought, acted, and experienced their surroundings. And within this reality, the continuous operation of the routine highlighted the extent to which order was maintained through repetition, as the system relied on the ongoing execution of the same sequence of events, creating a cycle that persisted without pause. And as individuals continued to move through this cycle, they remained part of a system that was defined by its consistency, its structure, and its ability to sustain itself through the repeated interaction between the routine and the individuals who lived within it. And in this way, the order and routine of Birkenau stood as one of the most significant aspects of the camp, shaping not only the organization of daily life, but also the deeper experience of those who lived within its boundaries, where each day followed the last, and where the system continued to operate unchanged through the passage of time. Chapter 10, Segment 1. The end of routine when the system began to shift. As the structured rhythm of life within Birkenau continued, repeating with a consistency that had come to define the experience of those inside the camp, there gradually emerged subtle indications that the system, though deeply established, was not entirely unchanging, and for individuals who had become accustomed to the repetition of routines, even the smallest variation could be noticed, not always immediately understood, but sensed as a shift within the familiar pattern that had guided their days. And within this environment, where predictability had become a defining feature, any change, however slight, carried a different kind of weight, as it stood out against the continuity that had otherwise remained steady over time. And as these moments of variation began to appear, they did not necessarily disrupt the routine entirely, but instead introduced a sense of difference within it, creating an awareness that the system, while structured, was still subject to change. And for those living within the camp, this awareness was often experienced through observation, as individuals noticed alterations in timing, movement, or organization, changes that might have seemed minor in isolation, but that collectively contributed to a growing sense that the environment was not entirely fixed. And as this perception developed, it influenced how individuals interpreted their surroundings, as they began to pay closer attention to the details of the routine, comparing what they observed with what they had come to expect. And within this process, the experience of daily life became more layered, as the familiar structure of the routine was now accompanied by an awareness of its potential to shift. And as the days continued to unfold, this awareness did not necessarily lead to immediate conclusions or clear understanding, but it did create a space for reflection, where individuals considered the meaning of these changes and how they might relate to the broader context of their situation. And within this reflective space, the concept of the routine itself began to take on a new dimension, no longer seen as entirely fixed, but as something that could evolve, even if the nature and direction of that evolution remained uncertain. And as individuals continued to navigate their daily lives, this emerging awareness became part of their experience, shaping how they approached each stage of the routine and how they understood the environment around them. And in this way, the early signs of change within the system introduced a new element into the experience of life within Birkenau, one that coexisted with the established structure and added a layer of complexity to the understanding of the camp, as individuals found themselves living not only within a routine, but also within a moment of transition, where the familiar patterns of the past were still present, yet accompanied by the possibility of something different. As this sense of change continued to develop, it gradually influenced not only the observation of routine but also the internal experience of those living within the camp, creating a shift in perspective that extended beyond the immediate details of daily life. And within this evolving awareness, individuals began to experience the routine in a slightly different way, as the familiarity that had once defined it was now accompanied by a sense of anticipation, where each day held not only the expectation of repetition but also the possibility of variation. And as this dual perception took shape, it affected how individuals engaged with their environment, as they remained attentive to the structure of the routine while also becoming more aware of the subtle differences that might emerge. And within this context, the experience of time also began to shift, as the repetition of days was now interwoven with a sense of progression, where changes, however gradual, contributed to the feeling that the system was moving in a direction, even if that direction was not clearly understood. And as individuals navigated this evolving landscape, they often relied on observation and reflection to make sense of what they were experiencing, drawing in their familiarity with the routine to identify what was different and considering how these differences might fit into the broader context of their situation. And within this process, the relationship between the individual and the system became more dynamic as the structured environment continued to shape daily life while also presenting moments that suggested its capacity to change. And as this dynamic unfolded, it introduced a new layer of complexity into the experience of living within Birkenau, where stability and transition existed simultaneously, each influencing how individuals perceived their surroundings and their place within the camp. And as the days continued to pass, this sense of transition became more integrated into the overall experience, shaping not only the external observation of routine but also the internal understanding of what it meant to live within a system that, while deeply established, was not entirely static. And in this way, the gradual emergence of change within the routine marked the beginning of a new phase in the experience of life within Birkenau, one defined by the coexistence of continuity and transformation, where the familiar patterns of daily life were still present, yet accompanied by an evolving awareness that the system itself was beginning to shift, creating a moment of quiet but significant transition within the broader narrative of the camp. Chapter 10, Segment 2. The gradual unraveling when order began to loosen. As the subtle shifts within the routine of Birkenau became more noticeable over time, what had once appeared as isolated variations began to form a broader pattern, one that suggested not just momentary change, but a gradual loosening of the tightly structured system that had defined daily life within the camp. And for individuals who had spent extended periods navigating the consistency of this environment, this transformation was not experienced as a sudden break, but rather as a slow and unfolding process where the familiar patterns of order began to show signs of strain, not always in obvious or immediate ways, but through small inconsistencies that accumulated over time, creating an atmosphere that felt different from what had come before. And within this evolving environment, the routines that had once operated with precision and predictability began to display subtle irregularities, whether in timing, organization, or execution. And as these irregularities appeared, they introduced a sense of unpredictability into a system that had long been defined by its consistency. And for those living within the camp, this change was often first recognized through observation, as individuals compared the present moment with their memory of how the routine had previously functioned, noting differences that, while perhaps minor in isolation, collectively signaled a shift in the overall structure. And as this awareness developed, it influenced how individuals perceived their surroundings, as the sense of stability that had once accompanied the routine was now accompanied by a growing recognition that the system was no longer operating in exactly the same way. And within this context, the experience of daily life became more complex, as individuals continued to move through the established sequence of events while also navigating the uncertainties introduced by these changes. And as this dual experience unfolded, it created a dynamic where the past and present coexisted, in a more pronounced way, with the memory of the earlier structure serving as a reference point for understanding the changes that were occurring. And as individuals engaged with this process, they often found themselves reflecting on the nature of the system itself, considering how something that had appeared so fixed and consistent could begin to change, and what these changes might mean for the future. And within this reflective space, the concept of order took on a new dimension, no longer seen as an unchanging constant, but as something that could evolve, adapt, and even weaken over time. And as the days continued to pass, this evolving understanding became part of the lived experience within Birkenau, shaping how individuals approached their routines, how they interpreted their surroundings, and how they understood the broader trajectory of the system in which they lived. And in this way, the gradual unraveling of order did not occur as a single event, but as an ongoing process, experienced through observation, reflection, and adaptation, and marking a significant transition in the nature of life within the camp, where the once rigid structure began to reveal its capacity for change. As this process of gradual change continued to unfold, its effects became more deeply integrated into both the external structure of the camp and the internal experiences of those living within it, creating an environment where the distinction between stability and uncertainty became increasingly blurred. And within this shifting landscape, individuals found themselves adapting once again, not to a fixed routine as they had before, but to a system that was in transition where the familiar patterns of daily life still existed, yet were no longer entirely predictable. And as this adaptation took place, it required a different kind of awareness, one that was attentive not only to what was happening in the present moment, but also to how those events differed from what had come before. And within this heightened awareness, individuals often became more observant of their surroundings, noticing details that might previously have gone unremarked, and using these observations to build an understanding of how the system was changing. And as this understanding developed, it influenced how they approached each day, as the expectation of consistency was replaced, at least in part, by an openness to variation, where each stage of the routine carried the possibility of being slightly different from the last. And within this context, the experience of time also shifted once again, as the repetition of days was now interwoven with a sense of progression, where the changes in the routine created a perception of movement, even if direction and outcome of that movement remained uncertain. And as individuals navigated this evolving experience, they often relied on their previous familiarity with the system to interpret what was happening, using their understanding of the established order as a framework for recognizing how it was being altered. And within this process, the relationship between the individual and the system became more fluid, as the structure that had once defined their daily lives was now itself subject to change, creating a dynamic where adaptation was once again necessary, not to maintain alignment with a fixed routine, but to navigate a system that was gradually transforming. And as this transformation continued, it became an integral part of the experience of life within Birkenau, shaping how individuals perceived their environment, how they responded to the unfolding changes, and how they understood their place within a system that was no longer entirely stable. And in this way, the gradual unraveling of order represented not only a change in the external structure of the camp, but also a shift in the internal experience of those who lived within it, marking a transition from a world defined by rigid consistency to one characterized by uncertainty and evolution, where the familiar patterns of the past gave way to a new and less predictable reality. Chapter 10, Segment 3. The End of the System: A Shift in the Experience of the Camp. As the gradual unraveling of order within Birkenau continued to unfold, the changes that had once appeared subtle and fragmented began to take on a more cohesive form, shaping an environment where the system that had long defined daily life was no longer experienced in the same way. And for those who had lived within its structure, this transformation was not a single moment, but the culmination of a process that had been developing over time, where the familiar patterns of routine, authority, and control were increasingly accompanied by variations that signaled a broader shift. And within this evolving context, individuals found themselves navigating a reality that was both recognizable and different, as the elements of the system still remained present, yet no longer carried the same sense of consistency or permanence that they once had. And as this awareness deepened, it influenced how individuals perceived their surroundings, as the environment that had once felt structured and predictable now appeared more fluid, with changes occurring in ways that were not always fully understood but were nonetheless evident in the experience of daily life. And within this fluidity, the concept of the system itself began to change, as it was no longer seen as an unchanging framework, but as something that could shift, adapt, and eventually give way to something new, even if the nature of that change remained uncertain. And as individuals moved through this transitional phase, they often relied on observation and reflection to make sense of what was happening, comparing the present state of the camp with their memories of how it had functioned before. And within this comparison, the differences became more pronounced, highlighting the extent to which the system had evolved. And as these differences accumulated, they contributed to a growing sense that the environment was moving toward a conclusion, not necessarily defined by a clear or immediate endpoint, but by the recognition that the conditions that had once seemed constant were no longer entirely stable. And within this recognition, the experience of daily life took on a new dimension, as individuals continued to engage with the routines and structures that remained, while also becoming increasingly aware of their transformation. And as this dual awareness developed, it created a complex and layered experience, where the past and present coexisted in a more pronounced way, each informing how the other was understood. And as the days continued to pass, this sense-of transition became more integrated into the overall experience of life within Birkenau, shaping not only how individuals navigated their environment, but also how they understood the broader trajectory of the system in which they lived. And in this way, the final phase of the system's evolution was experienced not as a sudden end, but as a gradual and unfolding shift, where the familiar structures of the past gave way to a new and uncertain reality, marking the closing chapter of a system that had once defined every aspect of life within the camp. As this transition reached its later stages, the experience of living within Birkenau became increasingly defined by the coexistence of what remained and what was changing, creating an environment where individuals were simultaneously grounded in the routines they had come to know and aware of the transformation that was taking place around them. And within this environment, the sense of finality began to emerge, not necessarily as a clearly defined event, but as an underlying awareness that the system, as it had once been understood, was approaching its end. And for those living within the camp, this awareness was shaped by a combination of observation, reflection, and the cumulative experience of the changes that had occurred over time. And as this awareness developed, it influenced how individuals engaged with their daily lives, as the routines that had once been followed with a sense of predictability were now experienced within a broader context of transition, where each action, each moment, was part of a larger process that was moving toward an unknown conclusion. And within this context, the perception of time once again shifted, as the repetition of days was now accompanied by a sense of progression toward an endpoint, creating a dynamic where the present was understood not only in relation to the past, but also in anticipation of what might come next. And as individuals navigated this evolving experience, they often turned inward, reflecting on their journey through the system, considering how their understanding of the environment had changed, and how the shifts they were witnessing fit into the broader narrative of their time within the camp. And within this reflective process, the meaning of the system itself became more complex, as it was no longer defined solely by its structure and routines, but also by its transformation and eventual dissolution. And as this understanding took shape, it contributed to a deeper awareness of the nature of change within such an environment, highlighting how even the most rigid systems are subject to evolution over time. And as the final stages of this process unfolded, the experience of life within Birkenau was marked by a unique combination of continuity and closure, where the familiar elements of daily life remained present, yet were now framed within the context of an ending. And in this way, the conclusion of the system represented not only a change in the external structure of the camp, but also a shift in the internal experience of those who had lived within it, marking the end of a chapter defined by routine, control, and adaptation, and the beginning of a new phase that, while uncertain, existed beyond the boundaries of the system that had once shaped every aspect of their daily lives. And so, as we reach the end of this journey through Birkenau, what remains is not just the memory of a place, but an understanding of how systems, routines, and human experiences became intertwined in one of history's darkest chapters, where daily life unfolded within a structure that seemed unchanging, yet ultimately could not last forever. And through these moments, through the routines, the waiting, the uncertainty, and the gradual shifts, we are reminded of the importance of remembering, of looking back not just to understand the past, but to ensure that it is never forgotten, because history, even in its quietest details, carries lessons that extend far beyond its time. And if you found this documentary meaningful, take a moment to reflect and consider supporting the channel by subscribing, so more stories like this can continue to be told and remembered.